There is a feeling that comes in the quiet hours when the modern world grows dim and the mind begins to wander toward older things, older questions, the kind that have no quick answers but invite contemplation instead, a slow turning over of ideas that have moved through centuries like water through stone, shaping and reshaping the way human beings understand themselves and the cosmos they inhabit. Tonight, the thoughts drift towards something called Hermeticism, a word that carries within it the weight of ancient libraries and candlelit studies, of philosophers bent over manuscripts, of seekers tracing symbols in sand and ink, trying to decode the relationship between the stars above and the soul within. The air feels different when contemplating such things, as if by merely thinking about these old traditions, something shifts in the atmosphere. Not literally, of course, but in that subtle way that happens when the mind enters a different mode of attention, a softer, more receptive state. Hermeticism is not one single thing, not one book or one teaching, but rather a river with many tributaries, each flowing from different sources, each carrying its own particular minerals and sediments, yet all mingling together into something larger, something that has nourished Western thought for more than 2,000 years. The name itself points backward to a figure both historical and mythical, Hermes Trismegistus, Hermes the thrice great, a curious blending of the Greek god, Hermes, and the Egyptian god, Thoth, both deities associated with writing, with wisdom, with the transmission of knowledge between worlds, between gods and mortals, between the visible and invisible. In the ancient imagination, this figure became the perfect vessel for a certain kind of knowing, the kind that cannot be found through reason alone, nor through faith alone, but through some third path, some marriage of observation and intuition, of star-watching and soul-searching. The texts attributed to this mysterious Hermes would eventually be called the Hermetica, and they would travel through time in the most unexpected ways, sometimes hidden, sometimes celebrated, sometimes condemned, always adapted to the needs and fears and longings of each new age that encountered them. But before exploring those journeys, there is something worth noticing about the very impulse behind Hermeticism. The fundamental question it seems to ask, which is not so much what should I believe, but rather what is the nature of the connection between all things? This is a different kind of question than the ones posed by many religions or philosophies. It does not begin with commandments or logical proofs, but with observation, with noticing patterns, with wondering why the same forms appear at different scales, why the spiral shows up in seashells and galaxies, why cycles repeat in nature and in human experience, why the microcosm seems to mirror the macrocosm. The ancient practitioners of what would come to be called Hermetic wisdom were often people who stood at thresholds, geographically and intellectually. They lived in places where cultures mixed, where Egyptian priests conversed with Greek philosophers, where Jewish mystics encountered Persian astronomers, where the trade routes carried not just spices and silk, but ideas, cosmologies, techniques for transforming consciousness and matter alike. Alexandria, in particular, becomes important to this story, a city on the Mediterranean coast where the library held scrolls from every known tradition, where scholars could spend lifetimes comparing creation, myths, and medical theories, where someone curious enough could begin to sense the deeper patterns beneath the surface differences. In such a place, in the centuries around the beginning of the Common Era, certain texts began to circulate, dialogues mostly, written as conversations between a master and a student, between Hermes and his disciples, addressing questions about the nature of God, the structure of the cosmos, the destiny of the human soul, the methods by which matter might be purified or consciousness expanded. These were not systematic treatises, not philosophical arguments in the Greek style, but something more atmospheric, more suggestive. They painted pictures with words, described visions, offered aphorisms that were meant to be contemplated rather than simply understood. One of the most famous of these texts would eventually be called the Poimandres, a title that might mean shepherd of men or knowledge of depending on which linguistic thread one follows. And it describes a visionary experience in which cosmic secrets are revealed, not through deduction, but through direct perception, a kind of knowing that comes when the mind quiets enough to receive rather than construct. And this perhaps is the tone to carry forward, this sense of receiving rather than grasping, of allowing the story to unfold at its own pace. Like watching stars emerge as the sky darkens, not rushing them, not demanding they appear all at once, but simply noticing, breathing, and continuing to pay attention as more and more becomes visible. The night is long, and there is much to explore, but there is no hurry. The ancient texts themselves insist on patience, on the gradual transformation that comes not from force, but from sustained, gentle attention. And so the opening widens, the doorway stands ready, and the journey through centuries of Hermetic thought begins to reveal itself slowly, like hieroglyphs emerging from shadow as the torch moves closer. The story properly begins not in one place, but in many, because Hermeticism, as it would come to be known, emerged from a confluence, a meeting of waters that had been flowing separately for centuries: Egyptian, Greek, Persian, Jewish, each tradition carrying its own understanding of the divine, its own methods for approaching mystery. In Egypt, long before the Greeks arrived, there existed a priestly tradition centered around Thoth, the ibis-headed god who was said to have invented writing, mathematics, astronomy, magic, all the arts by which invisible realities could be made visible, by which the chaos of experience could be organized into meaning. Thoth was the scribe of the gods, the mediator, the one who weighed hearts in the afterlife and recorded the results, and temples dedicated to him became centers of learning where priests studied the movements of stars, the properties of minerals and plants, the subtle correspondences between earthly phenomena and celestial patterns. These priests understood their work as something more than what we might call science or religion. It was a unified practice, a way of reading the world as a vast text written by divine intelligence, and their goal was literacy in this cosmic language. When Alexander the Great swept through Egypt in 332 BCE, he brought with him not just armies, but the entire intellectual apparatus of a Greek culture, and after his death, when his general Ptolemy established a dynasty in Egypt, something unprecedented began to happen. The new city of Alexandria became a deliberate experiment in cultural synthesis. The Ptolemies built the famous library and museum, not merely to collect texts, but to actively encourage the translation and comparison of different wisdom traditions. Egyptian priests were invited to explain their cosmology to Greek philosophers, and Greek philosophers were invited to interpret Egyptian rituals through the lens of Platonic thought. This was the crucible, the alchemical vessel in which Hermeticism would take shape, not as a corruption of some pure Egyptian original, nor as a Greek invention merely draped in exotic imagery, but as a genuine third thing, a new form of understanding born from sustained dialogue between traditions. The figure of Hermes Trismegistus emerges from this dialogue. The Greeks already identified their god Hermes with the Egyptian Thoth. Both were psychopomps, guides of souls, both associated with boundaries and transitions, with the movement between realms, and in the cosmopolitan atmosphere of Hellenistic Egypt, this identification deepened, became more than mere equation, became fusion. The epithet Trismegistus, meaning thrice greatest, may have been an intensification of an Egyptian formula, a way of saying not just great but supremely great, great in three worlds perhaps, the celestial, the terrestrial, and the underworld, or great as priest, as philosopher, as king, the traditional three aspects of Egyptian divine wisdom. Whoever first wrote under this name, and there were certainly many authors over many generations, they were creating something intentional, a voice that could speak with authority across cultural boundaries, that could address Greeks in terms they would recognize while preserving Egyptian sensibilities about the interpenetration of matter and spirit. The earliest Hermetic texts likely date from the 1st century BCE to the 3rd century CE, though dating is difficult because the texts themselves claim timeless origins. They present themselves not as innovations, but as the recovery of ancient knowledge, knowledge from before the flood, before the confusion of languages, knowledge inscribed in stone or whispered in temple sanctuaries when the world was young. This claim to antiquity was not deception exactly, but rather a different understanding of what constitutes truth. For the Hermetic authors, the validity of an idea did not depend on its novelty, but on its alignment with eternal principles. And so to say something was ancient was to say it was true, rooted in the fundamental structure of reality itself. The texts took various forms. Some were philosophical dialogues in the Greek style, exploring questions about the nature of God, the origin of the cosmos, the relationship between fate and free will. Others were technical manuals, instructions for making talismans, blending incenses, timing rituals according to astrological configurations, drawing down celestial influences into material objects. This dual nature, philosophical and practical, contemplative and operative, would remain characteristic of Hermeticism throughout its history. It was never content to be merely theoretical. It always insisted that knowledge must lead to transformation, that understanding the cosmos was inseparable from transforming oneself, from achieving what the texts called gnosis, direct experiential knowledge of the divine. One of the central philosophical texts, the Poimandres, describes a vision in which the seer's mind is lifted up and shown the process of creation, how from the infinite light of the divine mind the cosmos emerged in stages, first as thought, then as word, then as form, and how human beings, uniquely among creatures, contain within themselves both the mortal material body and the immortal divine intellect. This teaching had profound implications. It meant that the human being was not simply a creature within the cosmos, but a microcosm, a miniature version of the whole, containing potentially all the powers and principles that govern the universe, and therefore capable through proper training and purification of accessing those powers, of becoming more fully what one already essentially is. The Hermetic path was thus presented as a kind of remembering, not learning something new, but recovering knowledge that had been forgotten, covered over by the distractions of material existence, by identification with the body and its passions. The goal was to awaken the divine intellect within, to let it rise like a spark returning to the great fire from which it came. Another important early text, the Asclepius, takes its name from the Greek god of healing, himself identified with the Egyptian Imhotep, and it presents a more elaborate cosmology, describing a hierarchy of divine beings, gods, demons, and souls, and explaining how the cosmos is held together by sympathia, sympathy or resonance, the principle that affects across any distance. This principle of sympathy would become foundational for all later Hermetic practice. It explained how astrology could work, how a plant grown under the influence of Mars might carry martial qualities, how a statue properly constructed and consecrated could become a dwelling place for a god, how the magician, by aligning himself with celestial powers, could work transformations in the material world. The Asclepius also contains one of the most striking passages in the entire Hermetic corpus, a lament for the future decline of Egypt, a prophecy that the sacred land would be abandoned, its temples empty, its gods silent, and only later, after a long darkness, would there be renewal, a restoration of the sacred order. This apocalyptic strain, this sense of living in a time of decline and hoping for restoration, runs through much of Hermetic literature, and it may reflect the actual historical experience of the communities that produced these texts, watching traditional Egyptian religion fade under Greco-Roman influence, watching the old certainties dissolve, and seeking in these writings a way to preserve what was essential, to encode it in a form that could survive cultural collapse. The Hermetica were written in Greek, the lingua franca of the Eastern Mediterranean, but they drew heavily on Egyptian imagery and concepts. They spoke of the Ogdoad, the group of 8 primordial gods, and the Ennead, the 9 divine principles. They referenced Egyptian cosmogonic myths, the emergence of the world from primordial waters, the separation of earth and sky, the creation of humans from the tears of the sun god. Yet they also incorporated Platonic philosophy, the theory of forms, the tripartite soul, the ascent of the mind from material illusion to intellectual truth, and they absorbed elements of Stoicism, the idea of cosmic sympathy, of logos as the rational principle pervading all things, of living in accordance with nature. And there were Jewish influences as well. The opening of the Poimandres echoes the opening of Genesis, the Spirit moving over the waters, the creation through divine speech, and some Hermetic texts seem to engage with Jewish angelology and mystical speculation about the divine name and the chariot throne described in Ezekiel. This was not eclecticism for its own sake, not a random mixing of incompatible elements, but rather a deliberate effort to find the common ground, to show that beneath the different names and narratives there was a single truth, a philosophia perennis, a perennial philosophy accessible to all who sought it sincerely. The communities that studied these texts were likely small, probably groups of initiates who met in private, who recognized each other through shared language and symbols, who transmitted teachings orally alongside the written texts, filling in gaps, explaining allegories, guiding practices that the texts only hint at. Some of these communities may have been associated with temples, particularly those dedicated to Thoth or Hermes. Others may have been more informal, circles of friends and seekers who gathered to read and discuss, to experiment with the techniques described, to share their experiences of prayer and vision and transformation. The social world of early Hermeticism remains somewhat mysterious. The texts themselves rarely describe their institutional context. They present themselves as timeless dialogues between master and student, and this very timelessness has allowed them to be adopted by many different communities across many different contexts. What is clear is that by the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE, Hermetic ideas were circulating widely in the Roman Empire. They were known to Christian writers like Clement of Alexandria and Lactantius, who sometimes quoted Hermetic texts approvingly as evidence that pagan philosophy could glimpse Christian truth. And they were known to opponents of Christianity like Celsus, who used Hermetic theurgy as an example of legitimate spiritual power that did not require belief in the incarnation. The boundary between Hermeticism and early Gnosticism is porous. Both movements emphasized gnosis. Both presented elaborate cosmologies involving emanations from an ultimate divine source. Both saw material existence as a kind of exile or entrapment from which the soul must escape. Yet Hermeticism generally maintained a more positive view of the material world, seeing it not as evil but as the beautiful handiwork of a good creator, worthy of study and even reverence. The technical Hermetic texts, those dealing with astrology, alchemy, and magic, were also proliferating during this period. These were often more fragmentary, more obscure in their language, filled with recipes and rituals that assumed the reader already possessed considerable background knowledge. These operative texts describe how to create a talisman that will protect against disease, how to blend metals under specific planetary configurations to produce alloys with special properties, how to use plants and stones in healing, how to construct phylacteries inscribed with divine names, how to perform fumigations that would attract beneficial spirits or repel harmful ones. Modern readers sometimes want to separate the philosophical Hermetica from the technical Hermetica, to claim that one is sophisticated spirituality while the other is mere superstition. But this division would have made no sense to the original practitioners. For them, the philosophy and the practice were inseparable. Understanding the cosmos meant learning to work with its principles, and working with its principles required philosophical understanding of their nature and origin. The early Hermetic worldview was fundamentally animist. It saw the cosmos as alive at every level, not just plants and animals, but metals and stones, stars and planets. All possessed soul or spirit to some degree. All were capable of perception and influence, and the skilled practitioner learned to communicate with this ensouled world, to negotiate with it, to align with its rhythms, rather than fighting against them. This was a world of correspondences, where everything connected to everything else through invisible threads of sympathy, where the healer could use a plant associated with Mars to treat martial ailments, where the astrologer could read in the heavens the patterns that would manifest on earth, where the alchemist could transform base metals into gold, not through chemical manipulation alone, but through spiritual purification that aligned earthly matter with its celestial archetype. And so the foundations were laid in those early centuries when Alexandria hummed with intellectual energy, when the library still stood, when it seemed possible that all the world's wisdom might be gathered and reconciled. Hermeticism emerged as one answer to the question of how to live in a world where multiple truths seemed to coexist, where Greek philosophy and Egyptian religion and Jewish mysticism and Persian cosmology all offered insights, but none seemed complete in isolation. The answer the Hermetic authors proposed was synthesis, not superficial mixing, but deep fusion, finding the patterns that repeated across traditions because they reflected something real, something structural about the nature of mind and cosmos. And this impulse toward synthesis, toward finding unity beneath diversity, would remain one of Hermeticism's most enduring contributions to Western thought. The centuries that followed brought both preservation and transformation. As the Roman Empire converted to Christianity, the status of Hermetic texts became increasingly precarious, yet also strangely protected by their very ambiguity. Church fathers faced a dilemma when encountering the Hermetica. On one hand, these were clearly pagan texts, products of the Egyptian mystery religions that Christianity sought to supplant. On the other hand, they spoke of a single supreme God, of the Logos, or Word, through which creation came into being, of the soul's immortality and its need for purification, themes that resonated deeply with Christian theology. Lactantius, writing in the early 4th century, quoted the Hermetic texts extensively, calling Hermes Trismegistus a prophet who had somehow glimpsed Christian truth before Christ. Augustine, too, engaged with the Hermetica, though more critically. He acknowledged their wisdom, but warned against the theurgic practices, the making of God's statues, and the invocation of demons, which he considered demonic deception. This Augustinian critique would echo through the centuries, creating a lasting tension in Christian approaches to Hermeticism. The philosophical texts could be tolerated, even celebrated as proto-Christian revelation, but the practical magical texts remained suspect, dangerous, contaminated by association with forbidden powers. As the Western Roman Empire collapsed and the classical world fragmented, much Hermetic literature was lost or scattered, but significant portions survived, particularly in the Byzantine East, where Greek remained the language of learning, and in the Islamic world where a massive translation movement was underway. The Islamic encounter with Hermeticism proved extraordinarily fruitful. Beginning in the 8th and 9th centuries, scholars in Baghdad and Cairo translated Greek philosophical and scientific texts into Arabic, and the Hermetica were among them. Hermes became known as Idris or as Akhnuk, identified with the prophet Enoch, a pre-Islamic sage who had received divine wisdom. Islamic philosophers and scientists engaged deeply with Hermetic cosmology. The idea of celestial influences on earthly affairs fit well with their own astrological traditions. The notion of sympathetic connections between things supported their medical theories, and the possibility of transforming base metals into gold captivated their experimental investigations. The great Islamic alchemist Jabir ibn Hayyan, known in the West as Geber, drew heavily on Hermetic principles. His elaborate theory of how metals were formed from sulfur and mercury in various proportions, how they could be purified and perfected, rested on Hermetic assumptions about the unity of matter and the possibility of transmutation through understanding celestial and terrestrial correspondences. Jabir's works, along with other Arabic alchemical texts, would eventually be translated into Latin, bringing Hermetic ideas back into Western Europe through a circuitous route, transformed by their passage through Islamic thought, but recognizably continuous with their Alexandrian origins. Meanwhile, in Byzantium, Hermetic manuscripts were being copied and studied in monasteries. Scholars like Michael Psellus in the 11th century wrote commentaries on the Chaldean oracles and Hermetic texts, trying to reconcile pagan theurgy with Christian theology, arguing that ancient wisdom could be purified and made safe for Christian use if properly understood. The Byzantine preservation of Greek manuscripts would prove crucial, because when Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Turks in 1453, many scholars fled westward, bringing their libraries with them. And among those precious codices were copies of the Corpus Hermeticum, the collected philosophical Hermetic dialogues. But even before the fall of Constantinople, Hermetic ideas had been filtering into medieval Western Europe through multiple channels. The Latin translations of Arabic alchemical texts, the magical handbooks like the Picatrix, which described elaborate talismanic operations based on Hermetic astrology, and the general revival of interest in ancient philosophy that characterized the 12th century Renaissance. Medieval scholars encountered a fragmented Hermeticism, bits and pieces quoted in approved Christian authorities, tantalizing references in Arabic scientific works, mysterious alchemical symbolism that seemed to promise knowledge of nature's deepest secrets. They did not yet have access to the full philosophical texts, but they knew something important existed, something that bridged the gap between faith and reason, between spirit and matter. The cathedral schools and early universities were places of ferment, where Aristotelian logic met Christian theology, where translations of Arabic science challenged traditional cosmology, where questions arose about the relationship between natural causation and divine providence, and Hermetic ideas offered one way of thinking about these problems, the notion of a world soul animating the cosmos, of nested hierarchies of being from God down through angels and celestial spheres to earthly creatures and minerals, of hidden signatures and correspondences that the wise could learn to read. All this provided a framework for understanding how God's will could be expressed through natural processes without reducing everything to blind mechanism or arbitrary miracle. Then came 1460, and everything changed, or rather, everything that had been brewing beneath the surface suddenly erupted into visibility. Cosimo de' Medici, the ruler of Florence and patron of arts and learning, acquired a Greek manuscript of the Corpus Hermeticum, and he assigned its translation to Marsilio Ficino, the brilliant scholar he had recruited to revive Platonic philosophy in the West. Ficino was in the midst of translating Plato's complete works, a monumental task, but Cosimo ordered him to set Plato aside and translate the Hermetic texts first. Cosimo was old and ill. He wanted to read these ancient mysteries before he died, and there was a sense that they contained something urgent, something that could not wait. Ficino completed the translation in just a few months, working with intense concentration, and the resulting Latin text, printed and distributed widely, became one of the most influential books of the Renaissance, second only to the Bible in its impact on European thought. What made the Corpus Hermeticum so electrifying was not just its content, but its perceived antiquity. Ficino and his contemporaries believed they were reading the words of an Egyptian sage who had lived in the time of Moses, or even before, a pristine source of divine revelation untouched by later corruption, a prisca theologia, ancient theology, that had been the root from which Greek philosophy and even Hebrew wisdom had grown. This belief was not unreasonable given the texts themselves, which claim great antiquity and present themselves as revealed wisdom, and given the references in early Christian writers like Lactantius and Augustine, who seem to confirm that Hermes Trismegistus had prophesied Christian truths. The conclusion seemed obvious. Here was a parallel revelation, perhaps even the original revelation from which all others derived. The Hermetic texts spoke of the divine mind contemplating itself and producing the cosmos through that contemplation, of the Logos or divine word as the instrument of creation, of humanity as containing both divine and mortal natures, of the need for the soul to ascend through the planetary spheres, shedding the garments of passion and illusion until it could return to its source in pure intellect. These themes resonated powerfully with Renaissance humanists who were trying to reconcile classical philosophy with Christian doctrine, who were fascinated by the possibility that human beings might, through education and discipline, realize their divine potential, who saw in the recovery of ancient texts a path to cultural and spiritual renewal. Ficino himself was not merely a translator, but a practitioner. He composed hymns to be sung to the accompaniment of a lyre while burning specific incenses, timing these performances according to astrological configurations to draw down beneficial planetary influences. He used Hermetic principles to create what he called spiritual music, designed to tune the soul to celestial harmonies. His villa at Careggi outside Florence became a kind of informal academy where artists and poets and philosophers would gather to discuss Plato and the Hermetic texts, to experiment with musical and visual correspondences, to explore how beauty in art might serve as a vehicle for spiritual transformation. This was Hermeticism not as abstract theory, but as lived practice, integrated into daily life and creative work. Ficino's student Giovanni Pico della Mirandola took Hermetic ideas in a different direction. Pico was convinced that all wisdom traditions, Christian, Jewish, Islamic, Greek, Egyptian, contained fragments of a single original truth, and he set out to demonstrate this through his famous 900 Theses, which drew connections between Kabbalah and Hermeticism, between Christian theology and pagan mythology, seeking the common ground beneath apparent differences. Pico's oration on the dignity of man, one of the most celebrated texts of Renaissance humanism, is deeply Hermetic in spirit. It presents the human being as a creature of indeterminate nature, capable of sinking to the level of beasts or rising to the level of angels or even beyond, through the exercise of free will and the pursuit of wisdom. This is the Hermetic vision of man as microcosm, containing all possibilities, determining his own fate through his choices. The Hermetic revival spread rapidly through Europe, in Florence, in Rome, in Venice, where the Aldine Press published beautiful editions of ancient texts, in Paris, where scholars debated the relationship between magic and religion, in London, where John Dee would build one of the greatest libraries of Hermetic and alchemical manuscripts in Europe. Dee was both mathematician and mystic, astrologer to Queen Elizabeth, and experimenter with angelic communication. He saw no contradiction between his work on navigation and optics and his attempts to converse with angels through elaborate rituals involving crystal gazing and complex symbol systems. For him, as for many Renaissance scholars, natural philosophy and spiritual practice were aspects of a single quest to understand and work with the hidden structures of reality. The 16th century became a golden age for Hermetic practice. Alchemical laboratories proliferated, often funded by princes and nobles hoping to transmute base metals into gold. But serious alchemists understood their work in spiritual terms. The transmutation of metals was understood as a parallel or symbol for the transmutation of the soul, the purification of consciousness through the same processes of dissolution, separation, and recombination that were applied to material substances. The alchemical texts of this period are dense with symbolism, drawings of the hermaphrodite combining male and female, the green lion devouring the sun, the king and queen uniting in a chemical marriage, dragons and eagles and pelicans, each image encoding multiple levels of meaning, chemical operations, psychological transformations, cosmological principles. Heinrich Kunrath's Amphitheatrum Sapientiae Aeternae, published in 1609, presents spectacular engravings showing the alchemist's laboratory as a temple space, with musical instruments and books of sacred texts alongside furnaces and alembics, prayer and experiment equally essential to the great work. The harmonization of spirit and matter in the creation of the philosopher's stone. Giordano Bruno, perhaps the most radical of the Renaissance Hermeticists, took the implications of a Hermetic cosmology to their extreme. He proposed an infinite universe filled with countless worlds. He rejected the traditional hierarchy with Earth at the center. He saw divinity immanent in all things, an infinite creative power expressing itself through infinite forms. Bruno's vision was deeply threatening to both Catholic and Protestant authorities. He wandered through Europe, teaching his ideas, publishing provocative books, until finally in 1592 he was arrested by the Inquisition in Venice, tried for heresy, and burned at the stake in Rome in 1600, refusing to recant his belief in the infinity of worlds and the universal presence of divine mind. His martyrdom marked a turning point. The Church was now actively hostile to Hermetic philosophy when it strayed too far from orthodox boundaries, and soon another blow would fall, this one intellectual rather than political, but equally devastating to Hermeticism's cultural authority. In 1614, the Protestant scholar Isaac Casaubon published a philological analysis of the Hermetic texts, using careful comparison of vocabulary and style. He demonstrated that the Corpus Hermeticum could not have been written in ancient Egypt, but must date from the early centuries of the Common Era, from the Hellenistic period or later. Casaubon's argument was sound. It was based on solid linguistic evidence, and it effectively destroyed the belief in the pristine antiquity of the Hermetic revelation. If these texts were not the ancient wisdom of Egyptian priests, but relatively late compositions influenced by Greek philosophy, then their authority was greatly diminished. They could no longer serve as an independent confirmation of Christian truth or as a source of pure pre-philosophical wisdom. the impact of Casaubon's critique was not immediate. Many scholars continued to value the Hermetic texts for their content, regardless of their date. But over the following century, as European thought moved toward rationalism and empiricism, as the scientific revolution transformed the study of nature, Hermeticism gradually lost its place in respectable intellectual discourse. Yet it did not disappear. It went underground into the proliferating secret societies and esoteric orders that would characterize the 17th and 18th centuries, into Rosicrucianism with its mystical Christianity blended with alchemy, into Freemasonry with its elaborate symbolic degrees and emphasis on spiritual transformation through ritual, into the countless private circles of seekers who continued to study the old texts, to practice the old arts, convinced that modern rationalism had discarded wisdom along with superstition. The 18th century was a curious time for Hermetic ideas, officially dismissed by the philosophes and scientists who were building the Enlightenment, yet thriving in the margins and shadows, finding new expression in movements that combined spiritual seeking with social reform. The Rosicrucian manifestos that had appeared in the early 1600s had sparked a wave of excitement and speculation, claiming the existence of a secret brotherhood of adepts who possessed ancient wisdom and the ability to heal the sick, to transmute metals, to read the book of nature. Though no one could find the actual Rosicrucians, the idea of such a brotherhood inspired countless imitators and claimants. Freemasonry emerged in this context, transforming from medieval stonemason guilds into a fraternal society with elaborate initiatory rituals. The Masonic degrees encoded Hermetic principles in symbolic form. The rough stone transformed into the perfect ashlar, representing the soul's refinement, the Temple of Solomon representing the cosmos and also the perfected human being, the various tools and emblems all pointing toward moral and spiritual lessons about transformation and enlightenment. The Freemasons attracted men from all levels of society, aristocrats and merchants, artists and scientists, all drawn by the promise of fellowship and the appeal of ancient mysteries. Lodges spread throughout Europe and across the Atlantic to the American colonies, creating networks of influence that would play roles in both the American and French revolutions. In Germany, a physician named Samuel Hahnemann was developing homeopathy, a medical system based on the principle that that substances which cause symptoms in healthy people can cure those same symptoms in the sick when administered in highly diluted doses. This was essentially a Hermetic principle of sympathy and correspondence applied to therapeutics. The idea that there are hidden relationships between substances and diseases that transcend material causation. Franz Anton Mesmer, around the same time, proposed the existence of a universal fluid or animal magnetism that pervaded all things and could be manipulated to produce healing. His theories were rejected by scientific commissions, but his practices, involving dramatic sessions where patients would experience convulsions and visions, attracted enormous popular interest and anticipated later discoveries about hypnosis and the power of suggestion. Both Hahnemann and Mesmer were drawing on Hermetic notions of invisible forces and correspondences, trying to translate ancient wisdom into modern therapeutic form. And though their theories were not accepted by mainstream medicine, they influenced the development of alternative healing traditions that persist to this day. The late 18th century also saw the flourishing of Illuminist movements, groups claiming direct contact with higher spiritual beings who would transmit wisdom and guidance. The most famous was the Order of the Illuminati, founded by Adam Weishaupt in Bavaria, though it was actually a rationalist political society rather than a mystical order, but the name and the idea captured the imagination and spawned endless conspiracy theories and fictional elaborations. More genuinely, Hermetic were the teachings of Louis-Claude de Saint-Martin, known as the unknown philosopher who wrote about the inner church, the spiritual temple that exists within each person, and about the path of reintegration by which the fallen soul could return to its divine source. His influence would extend into the 19th century through various mystical Christian movements. Emanuel Swedenborg, the Swedish scientist turned visionary, experienced a spiritual crisis in his 50s that led to years of systematic exploration of the spiritual world through visions and inner experiences. He described an elaborate cosmology of heavens and hells, of correspondences between the spiritual and natural realms, of degrees of being ascending from gross matter to pure divine love and wisdom. Swedenborg's writings were deeply influenced by Hermetic principles even as they were framed in Christian theological language. His doctrine of correspondences, that everything in the natural world corresponds to something in the spiritual world, is essentially the Hermetic axiom of as above, so below, and his insistence that true religion is about internal transformation rather than external observance echoes Hermetic emphasis on gnosis and regeneration. The 19th century brought new forms and new contexts for Hermetic thought, as European empires expanded and increased contact with Asian religions, particularly Hinduism and Buddhism. Seekers began to see connections between Hermetic ideas and Eastern philosophy. The notion of the divine self within, the cycles of emanation and return, the practices of meditation and visualization, the Theosophical Society founded by Helena Petrovna Blavatsky and Henry Steele Olcott in 1875 explicitly aimed to synthesize Western esotericism with Eastern wisdom. Blavatsky's massive works, The Secret Doctrine and Isis Unveiled, drew on Hermetic sources alongside Buddhist and Hindu texts, Egyptian mythology and Kabbalistic symbolism, creating a grand narrative of cosmic evolution and human spiritual development. Blavatsky claimed to be in contact with hidden masters, Mahatmas who dwelt in Tibet and transmitted ancient teachings telepathically. Whether or not one accepts these claims, her work succeeded in making esoteric ideas accessible to a wide audience, and the Theosophical Society became a major vector for the transmission of Hermetic principles into modern spirituality. The Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, founded in London in 1888 by William Wynne Westcott and Samuel Liddell MacGregor Mathers, took a different approach, creating an elaborate system of initiatory grades based on the Kabbalistic tree of life, combining Hermetic magic with Christian mysticism, Egyptian symbolism, and ritual techniques drawn from grimoires and alchemical texts. The Golden Dawn synthesized centuries of Western esoteric practice into a coherent curriculum. Members learned astrology, tarot, alchemy, ritual magic, meditation techniques, all organized into a progressive path of training meant to develop spiritual faculties and eventually achieve conscious contact with the higher self or holy guardian angel. Though the order itself fractured and dissolved within 2 decades due to personal conflicts among its leaders, its influence was enormous. Many of its members went on to become influential teachers and writers. Aleister Crowley, perhaps the most famous or infamous, developing his own system of thelema based on Golden Dawn foundations, but pushing its implications in more antinomian directions. Crowley's writings, particularly the Book of the Law, which he claimed was dictated to him by a discarnate intelligence in Cairo in 1904, presented a radical reinterpretation of Hermetic principles, emphasizing individual will as the fundamental cosmic force. "Do what thou wilt" shall be the whole of the law, a phrase that shocked conventional society, but which Crowley insisted meant finding and following one's true purpose, one's true will aligned with cosmic necessity. The early 20th century saw Hermetic ideas flowing into modern art movements. The symbolists and surrealists were fascinated by alchemical imagery and the idea of transforming consciousness through symbolic operations. Artists like Hilma af Klint and Wassily Kandinsky were influenced by theosophy and saw abstract painting as a way of making spiritual realities visible. Carl Gustav Jung's analytical psychology drew heavily on Hermetic and alchemical sources. Jung saw in the alchemical texts a symbolic vocabulary for describing processes of psychological integration, the union of opposites, the transformation of the personality through the encounter with unconscious contents. His concept of individuation, the process by which a person becomes their true self, is essentially a modern psychological rendering of the Hermetic quest for spiritual realization. Jung corresponded with the physicist Wolfgang Pauli about synchronicity, meaningful coincidences that could not be explained by causation, attempting to revive the Hermetic notion of a causal connections between psyche and matter. They speculated that quantum physics might provide a framework for understanding how consciousness and physical reality interpenetrate in ways that classical physics could not accommodate. After the Second World War, there was a resurgence of interest in esotericism, partly as a reaction against the horrors of mechanized warfare and totalitarian ideologies. People were seeking alternative frameworks, ways of thinking about human nature and cosmic order that emphasized spiritual values and the possibility of transformation. The counterculture movements of the 1960s and 70s drew on Hermetic ideas often filtered through theosophy and the Golden Dawn tradition, the interest in astrology and tarot, in altered states of consciousness achieved through meditation or psychedelics, in Eastern spiritual practices transplanted to Western soil, all reflected Hermetic themes of correspondence, transformation, and the search for gnosis. Academic study of Western esotericism also began to emerge as a legitimate field during this period. Scholars like Francis Yates published groundbreaking works on Renaissance Hermeticism and its role in the development of modern science, arguing that figures like Copernicus and Newton were influenced by magical thinking and Hermetic cosmology, even as they were laying foundations for the scientific revolution. This scholarship challenged the simple narrative of progress from superstition to reason, showing instead how Hermetic ideas about natural magic and celestial influences motivated experimental investigation of nature, how the belief that nature contained hidden sympathies and correspondences encouraged careful observation and testing, how the alchemical quest to transform matter contributed to the development of chemistry. The late 20th century saw an explosion of popular books on Hermeticism, Translations of previously obscure texts became widely available. Publishers like Fanes Press and Inner Traditions made alchemical manuscripts and Renaissance magical texts accessible to general readers, and authors like Stephen Hiller and Richard Smoley wrote introductions to Hermetic philosophy for contemporary seekers. The Internet age has brought another transformation. Online communities discuss Hermetic texts and practices. Digital archives make rare manuscripts available to anyone with a connection. YouTube channels offer lectures on alchemy and astrology. Forums debate the interpretation of symbols and the effectiveness of rituals. Hermeticism has become democratized in ways that would have been unimaginable even 50 years ago. Contemporary practitioners might work with Hermetic principles in therapeutic contexts, using archetypal imagery in counseling or in creative practices, using alchemical symbolism as a framework for artistic process, or in spiritual seeking, drawing on Hermetic meditation techniques and philosophical concepts to develop a personal path of understanding. There are also those who attempt to reconstruct historical practices, recreating Renaissance talismanic magic or Golden Dawn rituals with careful attention to period sources, and those who innovate, blending Hermetic ideas with chaos magic or creating entirely new systems inspired by the Hermetic emphasis on correspondence and transformation. The question of what Hermeticism means in a modern scientific age remains open. For some, it is purely symbolic, a rich vocabulary for describing psychological and spiritual experiences that are real, even if the cosmology is outdated. For others, it represents an alternative paradigm, a way of knowing that complements scientific knowledge by attending to meaning and quality rather than quantity and mechanism. And perhaps this is fitting, because from its origins in Hellenistic Alexandria, Hermeticism has always been adaptive, absorbing new influences, taking new forms, speaking to each age in the language that age can hear. The texts attributed to Hermes Trismegistus have survived not by remaining frozen in ancient forms, but by proving endlessly reinterpretable, endlessly applicable to new contexts and new questions. The river continues to flow, sometimes underground, sometimes visible and celebrated, sometimes dismissed and marginalized, but never entirely dry, because the fundamental questions it addresses remain vital. How do mind and matter relate? What is the nature of the human being in the cosmos? What kinds of knowledge and transformation are possible? And how might we live in alignment with the deeper patterns of reality? These questions take on new urgency in an age of ecological crisis and technological transformation, when the relationship between consciousness and the material world is being renegotiated, when ancient wisdom and cutting-edge science both grapple with the mystery of how observation affects reality, how intention influences outcome, how meaning emerges from matter, and so the deeper currents reveal themselves, the patterns that persist beneath the changing forms. What has remained constant through all these centuries of transformation and reinterpretation is perhaps not any specific doctrine or practice, but rather a way of seeing, a mode of attention that looks for connections, for resonances, for the hidden threads that link disparate phenomena into meaningful wholes. The Hermetic impulse is fundamentally poetic, not in the sense of writing verse, but in the older sense of poiesis, making, creating, participating in the ongoing creation of meaning. It sees the world not as a collection of dead objects governed by blind forces, but as a living text, a divine utterance still speaking, still inviting interpretation and response. This is why Hermeticism has always attracted artists and mystics alongside philosophers and scientists, because it treats knowledge not as mere information, but as transformation. What you truly know changes you, becomes part of you, and this integration of knower and known dissolves the sharp boundary between subject and object that modern thought takes for granted. The Hermetic practice of contemplating correspondences, noting how the same pattern appears in different domains, the branching of trees and rivers and blood vessels and lightning, the spiral in shells and galaxies and water going down a drain. This is not primitive confusion between unlike things, but recognition of morphological kinship, the same formal principle expressing itself at different scales and in different materials. Modern science has rediscovered some of these patterns under the name of fractals and scaling laws, finding mathematical regularities that govern phenomena from quantum fluctuations to the distribution of galaxies. And while the Hermetic astrologers may have been wrong about the mechanism by which planets influence earthly events, they were attending to real rhythms, real cycles, the way biological and psychological processes do indeed correlate with solar and lunar phases, with seasonal changes, with the long periodicities of planetary motion. The alchemists, too, for all their cryptic symbolism and failed attempts at material transmutation, were engaged in something profoundly important. They were exploring the phenomenology of transformation, watching closely as substances change color and consistency and behavior, noting the stages through which raw material must pass to become refined product, and recognizing in these processes a mirror of psychological and spiritual development. Jung's insight was to see that the alchemical sequence, negredo or blackening, albedo or whitening, citrinitas or yellowing, rubedo or reddening, described stages of individuation, the dark night of the soul when old structures dissolve, the clarification that follows, the dawning of new understanding, the integration that produces the gold of realized selfhood. Whether or not one accepts Jung's specific interpretations, his fundamental point remains valid, that the physical world and the psychological world are not separate realms, but different aspects of a single reality, and that attending carefully to material processes can illuminate spiritual ones, and vice versa. This is the Hermetic worldview in modern dress. The principle, as above, so below, often dismissed as meaningless mystification, actually encodes a sophisticated epistemological claim that we can know the transcendent through the immanent, the invisible through the visible, the macrocosm through the microcosm, because they share structure. They are variations on the same themes, and therefore analogy and correspondence are legitimate modes of knowing alongside analysis and measurement. Medieval scholars spoke of the Book of Nature as a second scripture, equal in authority to the written Bible, because both were authored by the same divine intelligence and therefore must ultimately harmonize. To read nature rightly was to glimpse divine intention, and this required not just empirical observation but also symbolic interpretation, seeing phenomena as signs, as meaningful communications from the mind that ordered the cosmos. This sacramental view of nature has largely been lost in modernity, where the natural world is treated as resource or mechanism rather than revelation, and perhaps this loss contributes to the ecological crisis, Because if nature is merely dead matter to be exploited, there is no reason for restraint beyond self-interest. But if nature is a sacred text, a living expression of divine creativity, then to damage it is not just imprudent, but impious, a failure to honor the source of our own being. Hermeticism offers one pathway back to enchantment, to seeing the world as alive and meaningful, not through rejecting scientific knowledge, but by embedding it in a larger framework that includes purpose and value, quality and significance, the how and the what, alongside the why and the wherefore. The Hermetic emphasis on personal transformation through knowledge also speaks to contemporary concerns in an age of information overload, where facts proliferate but wisdom remains scarce. The Hermetic insistence that true knowledge is gnosis, direct experiential realization that changes the knower, offers an alternative to mere accumulation of data. The path described in the Hermetic texts is not about learning doctrines, but about waking up, becoming conscious of what one actually already is beneath the layers of conditioning and distraction, the divine intellect that has always been present, but forgotten, covered over by identification with the body and its needs, with social roles and expectations, with the endless chatter of the discursive mind. This awakening is described not as achieving something new, but as remembering as the soul's return to its origin and the practices associated with it, meditation, contemplation of symbols, ritual enactment of cosmic dramas, are all designed to facilitate this remembering, to create conditions under which the deep self can emerge from beneath the surface self. And perhaps this is why Hermeticism continues to attract seekers in the modern world, because it offers a path of transformation that honors both intellect and imagination, that values reason without reducing everything to logic, that pursues spiritual realization without requiring adherence to fixed dogmas or institutional authorities. The Hermetic way is ultimately one of synthesis and integration, bringing together what modernity has split apart, mind and body, spirit and matter, reason and intuition, individual and cosmos, and in this integrative vision, there may be resources for addressing the fragmentation and alienation that characterize contemporary life. The journey through Hermetic history reveals not a single straight path, but a labyrinth, a complex meandering through many cultures and contexts, and yet certain themes recur like refrains in a long composition, the unity underlying diversity, the correspondence between levels of reality, the possibility of transformation, the marriage of opposites, the recovery of forgotten wholeness. These themes are not exclusively Hermetic. They appear in many wisdom traditions, but Hermeticism has been a particularly important carrier of them in Western culture, preserving through dark times ideas and practices that might otherwise have been lost, providing bridges between ancient and modern, Eastern and Western, esoteric and exoteric, and so the contemplation comes full circle, back to the beginning that was never really a beginning, because these ideas are older than their historical expressions. They emerge again and again because they touch something fundamental about human experience, about the relationship between consciousness and cosmos, about the longing to understand and the possibility of transformation. The texts attributed to Hermes Trismegistus will continue to be read and reinterpreted, each generation finding in them reflections of its own concerns and intimations of truths not yet fully grasped. And this is as it should be, because Hermeticism has always been less about preserving ancient answers than about keeping ancient questions alive. Questions about the nature of the divine, about the human place in the cosmic order, about the relationship between matter and spirit, about what kinds of knowledge and transformation are possible. These questions cannot be permanently answered because they arise from the very structure of reflective consciousness. They are the mind contemplating itself and the world it inhabits, and finding in that contemplation both mystery and meaning. The long twilight has arrived, that time of gentle fading when the boundaries between day and night blur, when the urgent clarity of noon gives way to softer tones, more subtle gradations, and the mind settles into a different rhythm, less concerned with distinctions and definitions, more receptive to intimations and atmospheres. The story of Hermeticism is ultimately a human story about the perennial effort to make sense of existence, to find patterns in chaos, to glimpse order beneath apparent disorder, to believe that the universe is not indifferent to consciousness, but somehow speaks to it, invites understanding, rewards attention with insight. Whether the old cosmology is literally true matters less than whether it captures something experientially valid, whether it provides a useful map for navigating inner and outer terrain, whether it helps orient us toward what is genuinely valuable and away from what merely seems so. The symbols and practices that Hermetic traditions have elaborated over millennia are technologies of consciousness, ways of training attention, of opening perception, of facilitating experiences that are difficult to achieve through ordinary modes of awareness. And like all technologies, they can be used skillfully or clumsily, can serve wisdom or folly, can illuminate or obscure. What they offer, when approached with discrimination and genuine seeking, is a path of exploration, a way of engaging with the mystery of existence that is neither purely rational nor purely devotional, but something between and beyond, a way that honors both the transcendence and immanence of the sacred, both the distance and intimacy of the divine. The night deepens now, and the stars become visible, those ancient lights that have witnessed the entire human story, that saw the priests in Egyptian temples, the philosophers in Alexandria, the alchemists in their laboratories, the mystics in their cells, all looking upward and inward, seeking the connection between the cosmos without and the cosmos within. And perhaps this is the final gift of Hermetic thought, this invitation to pause and look and listen, to attend to the world with patience and reverence, to notice the patterns that repeat and the variations that make each moment unique, to hold together the eternal and the temporal, the universal and the particular. The words fade now like breath on glass, leaving only the faintest trace, a residue of meaning that dissolves even as it forms. And what remains is not any specific teaching, but a quality of attention, a way of being present to mystery without needing to resolve it, comfortable with paradox and ambiguity, trusting that understanding comes not from grasping, but from allowing, not from force, but from receptivity. The ancient wisdom speaks most clearly in silence, in the spaces between words where thought becomes contemplation, where questions float without demanding answers, where the mind releases its grip and discovers a different kind of knowing, wordless and immediate, direct and transforming. And so the journey comes to rest, not at a destination, but in a continuing, the river still flowing, the stars still turning, the question still alive in anyone who pauses long enough to wonder, to look up at the night sky and feel the ancient vertigo, the recognition that we are somehow both infinitesimal and infinite, dust and divinity, matter contemplating its own mystery. The voice grows quieter now, softer, until it is barely distinguishable from the general hush, and perhaps this too is fitting, because the deepest truths are whispered, are suggested rather than stated, are known in that twilight consciousness where logic loosens and imagination stirs and something older and wiser than the everyday mind begins to speak. Let the words dissolve like stars into dawn. Let the thoughts settle like silt after flood. Let the long story of Hermeticism, of human seeking and finding and seeking again, rest now in that space beyond speech, where all the questions meet all the silence, and meaning emerges not from answers, but from the quality of attention we bring to the great mystery of being here, being conscious, being able to wonder at all. I imagine a quiet room where candlelight flickers against stone walls, and the air itself seems to hold its breath in anticipation of discovery. There is something about the stillness of evening, when the world outside grows dim, that makes certain thoughts feel closer, more tangible, as though ideas themselves were living things that drift through the shadows. Tonight, I find myself thinking about numbers, not as cold abstractions or mechanical tools, but as doorways into something vast and beautiful, something that has captivated human minds for thousands of years. I picture ancient courtyards where geometric patterns trace themselves across mosaic floors, each tile placed with careful precision, each angle measured with reverence. And I wonder about the hands that first understood these relationships, the minds that first glimpsed the hidden order beneath the chaos of existence. There is a particular quality to mathematical thought, a kind of luminous clarity that seems to exist outside of time itself, as though certain truths were waiting, patient and eternal, for the right person to notice them, to bring them gently into the light. I think of scholars bent over parchment in lamp-lit rooms, tracing figures with careful fingers, their minds reaching towards something just beyond ordinary perception, something that required not just intelligence, but a peculiar kind of courage, the courage to believe that the universe could be understood, that patterns could be found, that meaning could be extracted from the seemingly random dance of phenomena. The story of mathematics is not merely a chronicle of theorems and proofs, though these are certainly part of it. Rather, it is a story of human beings, of individuals who looked at the world and saw questions where others saw only facts, who felt compelled to dig deeper, to push further, to ask why and how with an intensity that bordered on obsession. I imagine walking through a garden at twilight, where the shadows grow long and soft, and in this quiet space I begin to see them, these figures from across the centuries, not as names in textbooks, but as people with hopes and frustrations, with moments of blinding insight and long periods of patient struggle. There is something almost dreamlike about the way mathematical understanding has accumulated over time, each generation building upon the work of those who came before, each breakthrough opening new territories of thought, new landscapes to explore, like travelers adding their own observations to an ever-expanding map of reality. I think about the ancient world, about civilizations that rose and fell while leaving behind traces of their mathematical wisdom, etched in stone, preserved on clay tablets, copied and recopied by scribes who might not have fully understood what they were preserving, but who sensed its importance nonetheless. The Mediterranean light has a particular quality in my imagination, golden and clear, falling across the white columns of temples, illuminating the agora where philosophers gathered to debate, where questions about the nature of reality were not idle speculation, but matters of profound significance. I picture the rivers, the Nile, the Tigris, the Euphrates, their seasonal floods creating practical problems that demanded mathematical solutions: how to measure land, how to calculate volumes, how to predict the movements of the heavens, necessity and curiosity intertwining, each feeding the other. There is a rhythm to this story, a slow unfolding, like watching stars emerge as the sky darkens, one by one, then in clusters, until the whole vault of heaven is alive with light. And so, as the evening deepens around this imagined room, as the candle burns lower and the shadows lengthen, I prepare to follow this thread backward through time, to trace the lineage of those remarkable minds who saw numbers not as servants of commerce alone, but as keys to unlocking the fundamental architecture of existence itself. The journey begins, not with a single moment, but with a gradual awakening, a slow recognition that would ripple across continents and centuries, transforming not just how humans calculated, but how they perceived the very fabric of reality. The earliest mathematical minds emerged from necessity, from the practical demands of civilization itself, where the flooding of rivers required measurement, where the construction of monuments demanded precision, where the movements of celestial bodies needed tracking for the planting and harvesting of crops. In the land between two rivers, in Mesopotamia, scribes sat in temple courtyards under the burning sun, pressing wedge-shaped marks into soft clay tablets, creating what would become humanity's first mathematical texts. These were not abstractions for their own sake, but records of trade, accounts of grain stores, calculations of field areas. Yet within these practical notations, something more profound was stirring. The Babylonians, working in the cities of Ur and Babylon, developed a sophisticated number system based on 60, a choice that still echoes through our world today in the 60 seconds of a minute, the 60 minutes of an hour, the 360 degrees of a circle. They could solve problems that would seem remarkably advanced, finding solutions to what we would now call quadratic equations, though they approached these challenges without the symbolic notation that would come thousands of years later. I imagine these scribes, their fingers stained with clay, learning their craft through repetition and apprenticeship, copying problem after problem, absorbing patterns, developing an intuition for numerical relationships that went beyond mere memorization. They created tables, vast catalogs of reciprocals and multiples, square roots and cube roots, transforming difficult calculations into exercises in looking up and combining known values across the desert, along the fertile banks of the Nile. Another civilization was developing its own mathematical tradition, the Egyptians, builders of monuments that still inspire wonder, approached numbers with a practical elegance all their own. The pyramids stand as testament to their geometric understanding, each massive stone cut and placed with extraordinary precision, the angles calculated to create structures that would endure for millennia. But beyond these monuments, there existed a sophisticated mathematical culture captured in papyrus scrolls, fragile documents that somehow survived the ravages of time. The Rhind mathematical papyrus, named for the Scottish antiquarian who acquired it, but copied by a scribe named Amos around 1650 years before the Common Era, contains 84 problems, each one a window into how the ancient Egyptians thought about numbers and relationships, how they divided bread, how they calculated the volume of granaries, how they worked with fractions in ways that seem almost alien to modern minds. The Egyptians represented fractions almost exclusively as unit fractions, parts written as 1 over some number. So instead of thinking of 2/5 as a single entity, they would express it as 1/3 plus 1/15. This approach, while seemingly cumbersome to contemporary eyes, reflected a deep understanding of numerical relationships, a different way of seeing the world of quantity. I think of Ahmes sitting with his reed brush and black and red ink, carefully copying these problems from an even older text. Now lost to history, he was preserving knowledge, yes, but also participating in a tradition, a lineage of understanding that stretched backward beyond his own time and would reach forward to ours. Both the Babylonians and Egyptians understood the relationship that would later be called the Pythagorean theorem, the connection between the sides of a right triangle, centuries before Pythagoras himself walked the earth. They used this knowledge practically in construction and surveying, perhaps without formulating it as an abstract principle, but recognizing its truth nonetheless. Then, in the Mediterranean world, as Greek civilization flowered, mathematics began to transform into something new, something that sought not just practical solutions, but eternal truths, universal principles that existed independent of their applications. Thales of Miletus, who lived around 600 years before the Common Era, is sometimes called the first true mathematician, though he was also a philosopher, an astronomer, a statesman. He traveled to Egypt, absorbing the mathematical knowledge preserved there, but he brought something new to these ideas, the notion of proof, of demonstrating why something must be true, not just observing that it appears to be so. I picture Thales standing on the shore, watching ships appear over the horizon, using this observation to deduce that the earth must be curved. Applying geometric reasoning to the evidence of his senses, he supposedly calculated the height of pyramids by measuring their shadows, understanding the relationship between similar triangles, seeing pattern and proportion in the world around him. But it was Pythagoras, born on the island of Samos around 570 years before the Common Era, who would transform mathematics into something approaching a religion, a path to understanding the divine order of the cosmos. Pythagoras traveled widely to Egypt, to Babylonia, absorbing the mathematical traditions of these ancient cultures. But when he returned and established his school in Croton, in what is now southern Italy, he created something unprecedented, a community devoted to the study of mathematics as a spiritual discipline. The Pythagoreans, as his followers were called, believed that number was the fundamental reality, that everything in existence could be understood through numerical relationships. They found these relationships everywhere in the harmonies of music, where they discovered that pleasing intervals corresponded to simple ratios in the movements of celestial bodies, in the proportions of the human form. I imagine their meetings held in secrecy, where mathematical discoveries were treated as sacred mysteries, where members swore oaths not to reveal certain teachings to outsiders, where the act of understanding geometry was simultaneously an act of approaching the divine. The Pythagorean theorem, the relationship between the sides of a right triangle, became their most famous contribution, though, as we have seen, this relationship was known earlier. What the Pythagoreans did was prove it, demonstrate its necessity, show that it could not be otherwise, and in doing so, they established mathematics as a deductive science built on axioms and logical reasoning. But the Pythagorean worldview, beautiful as it was, contained within it the seeds of a crisis, a discovery so disturbing that legend says the Pythagoreans tried to suppress it, to keep it secret, because it threatened the very foundation of their beliefs. The problem arose when considering the diagonal of a square. If the sides of a square have length 1, then by the Pythagorean theorem, the diagonal must have a length whose square equals 2. But no matter how hard they searched, the Pythagoreans could not find a ratio of whole numbers, a fraction, that when multiplied by itself would equal exactly 2. The discovery of irrational numbers, of quantities that could not be expressed as the ratio of integers, shook the Pythagorean faith in the primacy of whole numbers. Here was something geometrically real, the diagonal of a square that could not be captured by their numerical system. It suggested that geometry might be more fundamental than arithmetic, that continuous magnitude might not reduce to discrete counting. I think of the mathematician, perhaps Hippasus, whose name is attached to this discovery, reportedly revealing this troubling truth to outsiders. Legend says he was drowned for this transgression, whether as punishment or simply lost at sea. The story itself, true or not, reveals how deeply this crisis cut, how threatening this knowledge seemed to those who had built their entire philosophy on the primacy of rational number. Meanwhile, in Athens, mathematics was becoming intertwined with philosophy in new ways. Plato, born around 428 years before the Common Era, placed mathematics at the center of his educational program, above the entrance to his academy. He supposedly inscribed the words, "Let no one ignorant of geometry enter here." For Plato, mathematics was a bridge between the physical world of a changing phenomena and the eternal realm of perfect forms. A triangle drawn in sand might be imperfect, its lines slightly crooked, its angles not quite precise, but the ideal triangle, existing in the realm of forms, was perfect and unchanging, and through mathematical reasoning, through geometry, humans could apprehend these eternal truths. I picture the academy, students gathering in the grove of Academus, discussing philosophy and mathematics in the dappled shade, drawing geometric figures in the dust, debating the nature of knowledge and reality. Mathematics was not merely a tool, but a way of training the mind, of learning to think about the eternal rather than the temporary. Among Plato's students and associates, several names shine through the centuries. Theaetetus, who worked on irrational numbers, classifying them, bringing order to what had seemed chaotic. Eudoxus, who developed the method of exhaustion, an early approach to what would eventually become calculus, finding ways to calculate areas and volumes of curved figures by approximating them with straight-edged shapes whose properties were known. Eudoxus also tackled the problem of proportions, creating a theory that could handle both rational and irrational quantities, bridging the gap that had so troubled the Pythagoreans. His work was rigorous, careful, built on definitions and logical deduction, setting a standard for mathematical precision that would influence all who came after. The Greek mathematical tradition reached a kind of culmination with Euclid, who worked in Alexandria around 300 years before the Common Era, in the great library and museum founded by the Ptolemaic rulers of Egypt, a place where scholars gathered from across the Mediterranean world, where knowledge was collected, preserved, expanded. Euclid's Elements, 13 books covering geometry and number theory, became perhaps the most influential mathematical text ever written, used as a textbook for over 2,000 years, translated into countless languages, studied by generations upon generations of students, not because it contained entirely original discoveries, but because it organized, clarified, and systematized the mathematical knowledge of the Greek world into a coherent logical structure. I imagine Euclid working in the library, surrounded by scrolls, drawing from the work of Thales, Pythagoras, Theaetetus, Eudoxus, and many others whose names are lost, weaving their insights into a unified whole, starting from simple definitions and axioms, building step by logical step, each proposition proved before being used to prove the next, creating a monument of human reasoning. The Elements began with definitions. A point is that which has no part. A line is breadthless length, establishing the basic concepts with which geometry would work. Then came the axioms, statements assumed to be self-evidently true, such as the idea that all right angles are equal to one another, or that if a straight line falling on two straight lines makes the interior angles on the same side less than two right angles, the two straight lines, if produced indefinitely, will meet on that side. This last axiom, the fifth postulate, the parallel postulate, would haunt mathematics for centuries. It seemed less self-evident than the others, more complicated, and mathematicians would spend 2,000 years trying to prove it from the other axioms, or to find a simpler formulation. Their failure to do so would eventually lead to one of the most profound revolutions in mathematical thought. But that story belongs to a later chapter of our journey. From Euclid's carefully structured world, mathematics flowed outward like ripples on still water, touching other minds, inspiring new questions, opening territories that had not even been imagined before. Archimedes of Syracuse, born around 287 years before the Common Era, represented a different kind of mathematical genius where Euclid organized and systematized. Archimedes explored and invented, pushing into unknown regions with a combination of geometric intuition and mechanical insight that would not be matched for nearly 2 millennia. I picture him in Syracuse, that Greek city on the coast of Sicily, a place where practical engineering and abstract theory met and mingled, where the defense of the city required inventions, war machines, and clever devices, but where the mind could also soar into pure contemplation, seeking truths that had nothing to do with immediate utility. Archimedes worked on the measurement of curved figures, using the method of exhaustion pioneered by Eudoxus. But taking it further, with greater boldness and creativity, he found the area of a circle, proving that it equals pi times the square of the radius. He calculated the volume of a sphere, showing it to be 2/3 the volume of the cylinder that encloses it, a relationship so beautiful to him that he requested a sphere inscribed in a cylinder be carved on his tomb. His approach involved imagining curves as composed of infinitely many infinitesimally small straight segments, volumes as built up from infinitely many thin slices, ideas that anticipated the integral calculus that would not be fully developed until the 17th century, nearly 2,000 years in his future. But Archimedes also worked with enormous numbers, developing a notation system that could express quantities far beyond the ordinary Greek number system. In his work, The Sand Reckoner, he calculated how many grains of sand would be required to fill the entire universe, not because this had any practical value, but to show that no quantity, however vast, was beyond the reach of mathematical description. I think of him drawing geometric figures in the sand, so absorbed in his contemplations that when Roman soldiers finally breached Syracuse's defenses during the Second Punic War, he supposedly did not even look up. His last words, according to legend, were a plea to the soldier who would kill him. "Do not disturb my circles." The mathematical torch passed from Greek hands gradually as the center of learning shifted from Athens to Alexandria, and as Rome rose to dominate the Mediterranean world. The Romans, for all their engineering prowess, their aqueducts and roads and magnificent buildings, did not contribute significantly to pure mathematics. They were practical people, concerned with what worked rather than why it worked. But in Alexandria, even under Roman rule, the tradition continued. Claudius Ptolemy, working in the 2nd century of the Common Era, created the Almagest, a comprehensive mathematical treatment of astronomy that would dominate Western and Islamic thinking about the cosmos for over 1,000 years. Ptolemy's work required sophisticated mathematics, trigonometry, the geometry of spheres, tables of chords that served the same function as our modern tables of sines and cosines. He created a model of the universe with Earth at the center, using epicycles and deference, circles moving on circles, to explain the observed motions of the planets. It was wrong in its fundamental assumption. The Earth does not sit motionless at the center of creation, but the mathematics was elegant and powerful, capable of making predictions that matched observations with remarkable accuracy. I imagine Ptolemy gazing up at the night sky from Alexandria, watching the planets trace their mysterious paths against the fixed stars, then returning to his scrolls, calculating, adjusting his model, finding the right combinations of circular motions that would reproduce what he observed, mathematics as a tool for making sense of the heavens. The last great mathematician of the ancient world was Diophantus, who worked in Alexandria sometime around the 3rd century. His exact dates lost to the fog of history. He wrote the Arithmetica, a collection of problems focused on finding solutions to equations, particularly solutions in rational numbers. Diophantus worked with what we would now call algebraic equations, though he did not use the symbolic notation that makes modern algebra so powerful. He had symbols for the unknown quantity and for various powers of that unknown, a step toward abstraction, and many of his problems involved finding whole number or rational solutions to polynomial equations. questions that would later be recognized as belonging to number theory, one of the deepest and most beautiful branches of mathematics. His work would lie dormant for centuries, preserved in manuscript form, occasionally copied, but not widely studied, until it was rediscovered during the Renaissance, when it would inspire a new generation of mathematicians to grapple with questions about numbers and equations, questions that are still being explored today. As the Roman Empire fragmented and fell, as libraries burned and the old institutions of learning crumbled in the West, mathematical knowledge might have been lost entirely, but it found refuge in other lands, carried along different routes, preserved in different languages. In India, mathematics had been developing along its own distinctive path, with contributions that would eventually transform the entire discipline. Indian mathematicians worked with numbers in ways that the Greeks had not. They were comfortable with zero as a number in its own right, not merely an absence, but a quantity that could be manipulated, combined with other numbers in calculations. The development of the place-value decimal system, where the position of a digit determines its value, and where zero serves as a placeholder, revolutionized calculation. Suddenly, arithmetic became vastly easier. Multiplication and division that required great skill with the older systems became straightforward procedures that could be taught to children. I picture scholars in cities like Pataliputra and Ujjain working with numbers written on dust boards, developing algorithms for calculation, exploring the properties of numbers. Aryabhata, born in 476 of the Common Era, wrote about mathematics and astronomy, including work on trigonometry and the solution of linear equations. He gave an accurate approximation for pi and understood that the Earth rotates on its axis, an insight that would be forgotten in the West for 1,000 years. Brahmagupta, working in the 7th century, explored what we now call Diophantine equations, after that Alexandrian mathematician who had worked on similar problems centuries earlier. Brahmagupta also worked with negative numbers, understanding them as debts, opposite to positive quantities representing assets. And he gave rules for arithmetic with negative numbers and with zero, rules that we still teach today. These Indian discoveries, the decimal place value system, the concept of zero, the rules for working with negative numbers would travel westward along trade routes, carried by merchants and scholars, translated from Sanskrit into other languages, becoming part of a vast exchange of knowledge that flowed across the medieval world. In the Islamic world, from the 8th century onward, a great flowering of learning occurred. Scholars working in Baghdad, Cairo, Cordoba, and other centers collected and translated texts from Greek, Sanskrit, Persian, Chinese, creating libraries that dwarfed anything in Western Europe at that time. Mathematics from different traditions met and merged, creating something new and vital. Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi, working in Baghdad in the 9th century at the House of Wisdom, an academy and library established by the Abbasid caliphs, wrote treatises that would shape the future of mathematics. His book on calculation with Hindu numerals helped spread the decimal place value system throughout the Islamic world and eventually into Europe. The word algorithm derives from the Latin version of his name, algorithmi. But al-Khwarizmi's most influential work was his book on al-Jabr, the restoration and balancing, a systematic treatment of solving linear and quadratic equations. The word algebra comes from aljaber, and this book laid the foundations for algebra as a distinct discipline, a way of working with unknown quantities, of manipulating equations to find solutions, of thinking abstractly about numerical relationships. I imagine al-Khwarizmi in the heat of a Baghdad summer, working in the house of wisdom, surrounded by texts from across the known world, synthesizing Greek geometry with Indian arithmetic, creating methods that were both practically useful for calculating inheritances and dividing estates according to Islamic law, and theoretically interesting, revealing patterns and structures in the world of number. Other Islamic mathematicians extended and deepened this work. Omar Khayyam, known in the West primarily as a poet, author of the Rubaiyat, was also a brilliant mathematician and astronomer working in Persia in the 11th century. He developed methods for solving cubic equations using the intersection of conic sections, bringing together algebra and geometry in creative ways. Al-Karaji, working around the year 1000, explored algebra further, working with polynomials, understanding how to manipulate expressions with multiple terms, laying groundwork for later developments. Ibn al-Haytham, known in the West as Al-Hazan, made profound contributions to optics and geometry, exploring the properties of parabolic mirrors, working on problems about the reflection of light. The Islamic mathematicians also preserved and extended Greek geometric traditions. They studied Euclid's Elements intensively, writing commentaries, exploring what could be proved and what required assumption. The parallel postulate particularly fascinated them, and several Islamic mathematicians attempted to prove it from Euclid's other axioms. Their failures, despite great ingenuity and insight, hinted at something profound, that perhaps the parallel postulate was truly independent, that other geometries might be possible, though this radical idea would not be fully developed for centuries. I think of these scholars working in cities that were centers of world civilization at a time when Western Europe was fragmented and poor, its learning confined largely to monasteries. They kept alive not just the mathematical knowledge of the Greeks, but extended it, combined it with insights from India and China, created new methods and new ways of thinking. Mathematics was international, crossing boundaries of language and culture, a shared human endeavor to understand pattern and structure. In China, yet another mathematical tradition had developed independently with its own distinctive character. Chinese mathematicians worked with rod numerals, making calculations on counting boards. They solved systems of linear equations using methods remarkably similar to what we now call Gaussian elimination. They explored magic squares and worked on problems in geometry and number theory. The 9 chapters on the mathematical art, a classic Chinese text whose origins reach back perhaps to the 1st century before the Common Era, though it was compiled and commented upon by later mathematicians, contained problems about agriculture, engineering, taxation, trade, showing mathematics embedded in the practical concerns of civilization, but also revealing sophisticated techniques, methods for finding areas and volumes, for solving equations, for working with fractions and proportions. Liu Hui, working in the 3rd century of the Common Era, wrote a famous commentary on the 9 chapters, providing proofs and explanations. He calculated pi to over 5 decimal places using a polygon of 96 sides, and he understood the method of exhaustion independently of the Greek tradition. Minds across the world, never in contact, reaching similar insights, drawn by the same mathematical truths. All these traditions, Greek, Indian, Islamic, Chinese, represented different approaches to the same underlying reality, different ways of thinking about quantity, shape, pattern, relationship, and slowly, gradually, as trade routes connected distant lands, as travelers carried ideas along with goods, these traditions began to influence one another, to cross-pollinate, creating a richer and more varied mathematical landscape. The Renaissance brought a reawakening to Western Europe as Greek and Islamic texts flooded into Italy through trade with the East and through the fall of Constantinople in 1453. Scholars rediscovered treasures that had been preserved elsewhere while Europe slumbered, and mathematics began to flourish once again in new soil. Leonardo of Pisa, known as Fibonacci, traveled throughout the Mediterranean in the late 12th and early 13th centuries, learning the Hindu-Arabic numeral system, the decimal place value notation that made calculations so much more efficient than Roman numerals. His book Liber Abaci, the Book of Calculation, written in 1202, introduced these numerals to European merchants and scholars, showing their practical advantages for commerce and their theoretical interest for mathematics. I picture Fibonacci watching merchants in North African ports, seeing how quickly they could multiply and divide using these strange new symbols, understanding that this was the future, returning to Pisa to share what he had learned. The book contained many problems, some practical, some recreational, including the famous rabbit problem that would give rise to the sequence bearing his name. 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, each number the sum of the previous two, a pattern that appears mysteriously in nature, in the spirals of shells and the arrangements of leaves, but the true algebraic revolution came in the 16th century, in Renaissance Italy, where mathematics became entangled with pride and competition, public challenges and secret methods. Scipione del Ferro, working in Bologna in the early 1500s, discovered a method for solving certain cubic equations involving the unknown raised to the third power. He kept this method secret, sharing it only with a few students before his death. In that era, mathematical techniques were sometimes guarded like trade secrets, sources of professional advantage. One of Del Ferro's students, Antonio Fior, challenged Niccolò Fontana, known as Tartaglia, the stammerer, due to a speech impediment caused by a childhood injury, to a mathematical duel in 1535. Each would pose problems to the other. The first to solve all the opponent's problems would win. Tartaglia, realizing the challenge would involve cubic equations, worked frantically and discovered the solution method himself, winning the contest decisively. But the story does not end there. Girolamo Cardano, a physician and mathematician of vast ambition and talent, persuaded Tartaglia to share the method, swearing an oath never to reveal it. Cardano then extended the method, solving more general types of cubic equations with the help of his student, Lodovico Ferrari, who also discovered how to solve quartic equations with the unknown raised to the fourth power, I imagine Cardano torn between his oath and his desire for recognition, eventually publishing these methods in his Ars Magna, the Great Art, in 1545, justifying his breach by claiming he had learned that Del Ferro had discovered the method first, making Tartaglia's claim to secrecy invalid. The resulting controversy, bitter accusations, challenges and counter-challenges reveals how intensely personal mathematics could be, how much ego and ambition drove these discoveries alongside pure curiosity. The solution of cubic and quartic equations represented a triumph, but it also revealed something strange and troubling. In the process of solving these equations, mathematicians encountered square roots of negative numbers, quantities that seemed impossible, meaningless, since no number multiplied by itself gives a negative result. Yet if they proceeded with the calculations, treating these impossible numbers as though they made sense, they arrived at correct real number solutions. These imaginary numbers, as they were dismissively called, would haunt mathematics for centuries. Gradually, reluctantly, mathematicians began to accept them, to work with them, to discover that they had profound applications. But that acceptance came slowly, with much resistance and confusion. Meanwhile, in the 17th century, mathematics was being revolutionized in other ways. René Descartes, working in France in the 1630s, brought together algebra and geometry in a powerful synthesis by introducing coordinates, by associating pairs of numbers with points in a plane. He made it possible to represent geometric curves as algebraic equations, and conversely, to visualize algebraic relationships as geometric shapes. I picture Descartes, according to legend, lying in bed watching a fly on the ceiling, realizing that the fly's position could be specified by its distances from two walls, the seat of what would become Cartesian coordinates, analytic geometry, a bridge between two realms of mathematics that had largely developed separately. This same century saw the emergence of calculus, perhaps the single most important development in mathematics since the Greeks. Two men, working independently, arrived at similar insights through different paths. Isaac Newton in England and Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz in Germany, both grappling with problems of motion and change, of curves and areas, of instantaneous rates and infinite sums. Newton, working largely in isolation during the plague years of 1665 and 1666, when Cambridge University was closed and he retreated to his family home in Woolsthorpe, developed his method of fluxions, a way of calculating instantaneous rates of change, velocities and accelerations, the slopes of curves at specific points. He also developed methods for finding areas under curves, for calculating the distances traveled when velocity varies continuously. Leibniz, approaching similar problems from a more philosophical and formal perspective, developed his own notation, the integral sign, the differential, symbols we still use today. His approach was more systematic, more easily taught and communicated, while Newton's insights were often bound up with physical intuition and geometric thinking. I imagine both men separated by the North Sea and the English Channel, neither knowing the other was working on the same problems, both experiencing those moments of breakthrough when suddenly the fog clears and a new landscape becomes visible, when techniques that had been impossibly difficult become almost routine, When problems that had stymied the greatest minds for centuries yield to new methods, the question of priority, of who discovered calculus first, would lead to a bitter dispute, poisoning relations between English and continental mathematicians for generations. Newton's supporters claimed he had discovered it earlier, even if he published later. Leibniz's supporters argued that independent discovery gave equal credit. The controversy became nationalistic. Ugly. A reminder that even in mathematics, supposedly the most objective of disciplines, human passions and prejudices intrude, but the calculus, regardless of its parentage, transformed mathematics and science. It made possible the precise description of motion and change. It allowed Newton to formulate his laws of motion and universal gravitation, explaining not just falling apples, but the movements of planets. It gave engineers tools to design machines and structures. It opened up entirely new fields of study, differential equations, the calculus of variations, problems that could not even be formulated before. The 18th century saw calculus extended and refined. Leonhard Euler, working in Basel, Berlin, and St. Petersburg, was perhaps the most prolific mathematician who ever lived, writing hundreds of books and papers, making contributions to virtually every area of mathematics known in his time, and creating new fields. He worked on number theory, graph theory, topology, mechanics, fluid dynamics, astronomy. Euler introduced much of our modern mathematical notation. The symbol E for the base of natural logarithms, the symbol I for the square root of -1, the function notation f of x. He discovered the beautiful relationship connecting E, I, pi, and the numbers 1 and 0 in a single equation, e to the power of I times pi plus 1 equals 0, a formula that links exponential functions, imaginary numbers, and geometry in a way that still seems almost magical. I picture Euler continuing to work even after going blind in his later years, dictating mathematics to his assistants, calculating in his head, his mental powers so extraordinary that blindness merely changed how he worked. It did not stop him. He saw mathematical relationships with an inner eye that did not depend on physical sight. The Bernoulli family, spanning 3 generations, contributed enormously to mathematics. Jacob and Johann Bernoulli, brothers who were sometimes collaborators, sometimes rivals, worked on calculus and its applications, on problems of curves and surfaces. Johann's son Daniel worked on probability and mathematical physics, hydrodynamics, the study of fluid flow, creating equations that still bear his name. Joseph Louis Lagrange, working in the late 18th century, brought new levels of rigor and generality to calculus and mechanics, seeking to place calculus on a firm algebraic foundation, removing some of the reliance on geometric intuition that had characterized earlier work. He developed the calculus of variations, methods for finding functions that maximize or minimize certain quantities, problems about optimal paths and shapes. What curve will a hanging chain form? What is the shortest path between 2 points on a curved surface? Pierre-Simon Laplace, working through the French Revolution and the Napoleonic era, applied mathematics to celestial mechanics with unprecedented sophistication. His Traité de mécanique céleste, treatise on celestial mechanics, demonstrated that the solar system is stable, that the seemingly irregular motions of the planets would not lead to collisions or ejections, that Newton's laws, combined with the power of calculus, could explain the heavens in exquisite detail. And when Napoleon supposedly asked Laplace where God fit into his system, Laplace is said to have replied, "I have no need of that hypothesis. Mathematics had become powerful enough to describe nature without invoking divine intervention at every step, though whether this represented triumph or loss depended on one's perspective. The 19th century brought revolutions in mathematical thought that would have seemed impossible to earlier generations. Carl Friedrich Gauss, often called the Prince of Mathematicians, made profound contributions to number theory, statistics, astronomy, geodesy, the study of Earth's shape. His Disquisitiones Arithmeticae, published when he was only 24 in 1801, transformed number theory into a systematic discipline, revealing deep patterns in the properties of integers. Gauss also worked on non-Euclidean geometry, exploring what happens if Euclid's parallel postulate is replaced with a different assumption. He discovered that consistent geometries could be built on this alternative foundation, geometries where the angles of a triangle do not sum to 180 degrees, where parallel lines might not exist at all. But he did not publish these findings, perhaps fearing controversy, perhaps not fully grasping their philosophical implications. Others were bolder. Nikolai Lobachevsky in Russia and János Bolyai in Hungary independently developed non-Euclidean geometries, publishing their results in the 1820s and 30s. Initially, their work was ignored or dismissed. The idea that Euclidean geometry might not be the only possible geometry, that mathematical truth might not be absolute and eternal, but dependent on initial assumptions, was too radical for many to accept. But gradually, the mathematical community recognized the validity and importance of these strange new geometries. Bernhard Riemann, in his famous 1854 lecture, generalized the concept further, imagining curved spaces of any dimension, geometries that would later provide the mathematical framework for Einstein's general theory of relativity, mathematics that seemed purely abstract, disconnected from physical reality, turned out to describe the very structure of space-time itself. I think of how mathematics evolved from practical calculation to abstract theory, from certain knowledge to the recognition that different consistent systems could exist, from a single edifice to a rich landscape of possibilities. The journey had been long, spanning millennia, crossing continents and cultures, and it was far from over, each answer opening new questions, each solution revealing new mysteries to explore. The story of mathematics is not merely a chronicle of discoveries. It is a testament to something fundamental in human nature. This deep hunger to find order, to detect pattern, to understand the hidden structures that govern reality. I think about the continuity, how a Babylonian scribe working 4,000 years ago and a modern mathematician working today are engaged in essentially the same enterprise, asking similar questions, experiencing similar moments of confusion and insight, separated by millennia but connected by the timeless nature of mathematical truth. There is something profoundly democratic about mathematics. A theorem proved in ancient Greece remains true today, accessible to anyone willing to work through the logic, regardless of their station or nationality or era. Mathematical knowledge accumulates, each generation standing on the shoulders of those who came before, adding their own stones to an edifice that grows ever taller and more intricate. The great mathematicians were not superhuman. They struggled, made mistakes, followed dead ends, experienced frustration and self-doubt. What distinguished them was perhaps a certain stubbornness, an unwillingness to accept that something could not be understood, a faith that patient thought could illuminate even the darkest corners of confusion. I picture them in their various settings. Archimedes drawing in the sand, Euler dictating to his assistants, Gauss working in isolation, each absorbed in contemplation, each wrestling with questions that had no obvious answers, no guaranteed solutions, just the possibility, the hope that clarity might emerge from sustained attention. Mathematics reveals itself slowly, reluctantly. A problem that seems impossibly difficult one day becomes almost trivial once the right perspective is found. But finding that perspective might require years, decades, sometimes centuries of collective effort. The history of mathematics is full of problems that resisted solution for generations before finally yielding, and others that remain open still, waiting for the right mind, the right insight. There is beauty in mathematical thought, a kind of austere elegance. When a proof works, when the pieces fit together just so, there is an aesthetic satisfaction comparable to experiencing great art or music. Mathematicians speak of beautiful proofs, elegant solutions, and they mean something real, a quality of inevitability, of rightness that goes beyond mere correctness. The interconnectedness of mathematics astonishes. Discoveries in one area unexpectedly illuminate problems in completely different domains. Number theory connects to geometry, algebra to topology. Abstract structures invented for their own sake turn out to describe physical reality with uncanny precision, as though the universe itself were mathematical at its core, as though beneath the messy complexity of phenomena lay a realm of pure form and relationship. I think about how mathematics changed not just what humans could do, but how they could think. The invention of algebra allowed thoughts that would have been impossible before. The development of calculus opened up entirely new ways of reasoning about change and motion. Each major advance in mathematical notation or technique was simultaneously an expansion of human cognitive capacity, new tools enabling new thoughts. The recognition that different consistent mathematical systems could exist, that Euclidean geometry was not the only possibility, that arithmetic could be done with finite sets of numbers where different rules applied. This pluralism represented a profound philosophical shift. Truth became more subtle, more contextual, dependent on axioms and definitions, yet no less rigorous for that dependence. Mathematics also humbled those who practiced it, revealing the limits of human knowledge. Gödel's incompleteness theorems in the 20th century showed that any sufficiently powerful mathematical system must contain true statements that cannot be proved within that system. There are truths beyond the reach of formal proof, mysteries that resist complete resolution. The dream of reducing all mathematics to a single consistent logical foundation, a dream that animated much 19th and early 20th century work, turned out to be impossible, not because mathematicians were not clever enough, but because of the inherent nature of formal systems themselves. Yet this incompleteness does not diminish mathematics. Perhaps it enriches it, suggesting depths that can never be fully plumbed, ensuring that there will always be new questions to ask, new territories to explore. The journey has no end, only way stations and temporary resting places before the next push forward into the unknown. I imagine the great river of mathematical thought, fed by countless tributaries, contributions from every culture that has contemplated quantity and shape, flowing through the centuries, sometimes moving slowly through periods of consolidation, sometimes rushing forward in rapids of revolutionary insight, carrying all who contributed, from anonymous scribes whose names are lost to celebrated geniuses whose work changed everything, all part of the same current, the same ongoing human conversation with abstract reality. The story winds toward its close now, not because mathematics has ended. It continues, vibrant and alive, new discoveries being made, new connections being forged, but because this particular telling must conclude, must release its hold on these themes and let them settle back into the quiet from which they emerged, I return to that imagined room where this began, the candle burning lower, the shadows deeper now, outside. The night has fully arrived, stars invisible through the window, but present nonetheless, tracing their mathematical paths across the darkness, indifferent to whether anyone watches or calculates their movements. There is comfort in mathematical truth, in knowing that certain relationships hold regardless of circumstance, that 2 + 2 = 4, whether anyone believes it or not, whether civilizations rise or fall, whether languages are spoken or forgotten. Some things persist, reliable, unchanging, anchors in a shifting world. The mathematicians themselves have faded into history. Euclid and Archimedes, Al-Khwarizmi and Fibonacci, Newton and Leibniz, Euler and Gauss, their mortal lives long concluded, but their insights remain, transmitted through texts and teachings, living on in every student who works through a proof, every engineer who applies an equation, every scientist who uses mathematical tools to describe nature. I think of mathematics as a kind of collective dream, a shared vision of order and structure built up over thousands of years by countless contributors, each adding their piece, some pieces large and fundamental, others small but necessary, all part of the vast mosaic, the pattern that emerges when human minds turn their attention to the abstract realm of quantity and form. The candle gutters now, the flame dancing one last time before settling into steadiness, a small circle of light in the encompassing darkness. And in this moment, it seems enough to have traced this path, to have followed the thread of mathematical thought through its long and winding journey, from ancient clay tablets to the most abstract modern theories, all part of one continuous story, one ongoing exploration. The room grows quieter, the air still, and the story releases its hold, letting go of names and dates, of theorems and proofs, dissolving back into the peaceful silence from which all stories emerge and to which they return, leaving only the faint echo of wonder, the gentle reminder that beneath the surface of everyday life, patterns wait to be discovered, relationships wait to be understood, and the human mind, curious and persistent, continues to reach toward them, generation after generation, seeking, finding, always seeking further. The light fades, thoughts drift, and in the darkness, numbers dance, silent, eternal, beautiful beyond words. I look up, and there it is, the night sky spread wide and endless above me, deeper than I ever remember it being, darker in some places, brighter in others, scattered with points of light that seem almost to breathe. For a moment, I simply stand here, letting my eyes adjust, watching as more stars emerge from what seemed like emptiness just seconds ago. Hundreds of them, thousands, and I know that each one is a sun burning across distances I can barely begin to comprehend. But tonight, I'm not thinking about those distant suns. Not really, because tonight my attention turns closer to home, to the family of worlds that circles our own star, the solar system, this small corner of space that belongs to us, that we've gazed upon since the first human eyes turned skyward. The word itself, solar, comes from the Latin for sun, and everything here, every planet, every moon, every grain of dust floating in the dark, all of it belongs to that central fire, our sun, the star we orbit, the light we wake to each morning. I imagined it now, the sun as it actually is, not the gentle disk we see filtered through our atmosphere, but the roiling sphere of plasma, hydrogen fusing into helium in its core, temperatures reaching 15 million degrees, a furnace so vast that 1 million Earths could fit inside it. And yet, from here, from this distance of 93 million miles, it appears as nothing more than a warm circle in the sky. Around it, the planets sweep their ancient paths, following the same orbits they have traced for billions of years, moving through the silence of space with a grace that seems almost choreographed, almost deliberate. I think about how we've always known they were there, those wandering lights. The Greeks called them planetae, wanderers, because they moved against the fixed stars, drifting through the constellations, marking time with their patient journeys, and for thousands of years, that's all we knew, that they moved, that they were different from the stars. But we couldn't see them, not really, not the way we can now with our telescopes and our spacecraft, our probes that have ventured to the edge of the solar system and beyond. Now we know them intimately. We've mapped their surfaces, tasted their atmospheres, walked on their moons, sent our machines to drill into their soil and measure their magnetic fields. We know that Mercury, closest to the sun, turns so slowly that a single day there lasts longer than 2 of its years, its surface scarred and cratered, baked to 800 degrees on one side, frozen to nearly 300 below zero on the other. We know that Venus, shrouded in clouds of sulfuric acid, hides a surface hot enough to melt lead, its atmosphere pressing down with the weight of being half a mile underwater on Earth. And then there's our world, Earth, the blue marble, the pale blue dot, the only place in all the universe where we know for certain that life exists, with its oceans and its continents, its storms and its seasons, spinning through space at 67,000 miles per hour. And yet we feel none of it, sitting here looking up beyond us. Mars, the red planet, rust-colored from the iron oxide in its soil, with its massive volcanoes and its canyon system that would stretch across the entire United States, and its 2 small moons, Phobos and Deimos, fear and dread, named by someone with a sense of mythology and perhaps a touch of darkness. And then, farther out, past the asteroid belt, where countless rocks tumble in their orbits, the giants wait, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, worlds so massive they could swallow all the rocky planets combined and still have room, worlds with dozens of moons, with ring systems made of ice and rock, with storms that have raged for centuries, with winds that make our hurricanes look like gentle breezes. I let myself drift through this mental map, this scale model I'm building in my mind, trying to hold it all at once, the distances, the sizes, the strange and wonderful variety of it all, 8 major planets, 5 recognized dwarf planets, hundreds of moons, millions of asteroids, billions of comets waiting in the outer dark, all of it, every piece, held together by gravity, by the invisible hand of the sun's mass, pulling everything into its dance, keeping the whole system spinning like a vast cosmic mobile, balanced, precise, beautiful in its mathematics. And I realize, standing here, that this is home, not just Earth, but all of it, the entire solar system, this bubble of sun-warmed space 4.5 billion years old, born from a cloud of gas and dust that collapsed under its own weight, swirled into a disk, condensed into worlds. The same atoms that make up my body were forged in stars that died before our sun was born, scattered into space by supernovae, gathered again, reformed, reshaped, until eventually, impossibly, they became conscious enough to look back at the stars and wonder, tonight, I'm simply here, beneath this sky, thinking about the neighborhood of worlds around us, the solar system in all its quiet vastness, ready to wander through it, world by world, moon by moon, taking my time, letting the details wash over me like waves. The story begins in darkness, in a cloud of gas and dust drifting through space, so vast it would take light years to cross, so diffuse that if you stood inside it, you might not even know it was there. This was a solar nebula, our birthplace, floating in one arm of the Milky Way galaxy. 4.5 billion years ago, give or take a few million years, a span of time so immense that human history fits into it like a single grain of sand on an endless beach. Something happened, some disturbance, perhaps a nearby star exploded, a supernova, sending shock waves rippling through space. Or maybe it was the gravity of a passing stellar cluster. Whatever it was, it compressed the cloud, squeezed it, and when you compress gas, it heats up. And when it heats up enough, things begin to change. The cloud began to collapse, slowly at first, then faster, pulled inward by its own gravity. And as it collapsed, it started to spin, the way a figure skater spins faster when they pull their arms in. Conservation of angular momentum, the universe following its rules, indifferent and precise. As it spun, the cloud flattened like pizza dough thrown into the air, forming a disk, and at the center of that disk, where most of the mass was concentrating, the pressure built, the temperature climbed. Hydrogen atoms pressed closer and closer together, and then ignition, the moment when the core became dense enough and hot enough for fusion to begin. Hydrogen atoms slamming together with such force that they fused into helium, releasing energy, enormous amounts of energy, and the sun was born. Our sun, a star like billions of others, nothing special on a cosmic scale, but to us, everything. The newborn sun wasn't alone. It had used only about 99.8% of the cloud's mass. The rest remained, scattered through the disk that surrounded it, the protoplanetary disk, the material from which worlds would form. In that disk, particles began to stick together, dust grains, ice crystals, tiny fragments of rock. They collided, Sometimes they bounced apart. Sometimes they stuck. Static electricity, molecular forces, building larger and larger clumps, pebbles, then rocks, then boulders, close to the sun, where the heat was intense. Only materials with high melting points could remain solid. Metals like iron and nickel, rocky silicates, the lighter elements, hydrogen, helium, water. These were blown outward by the solar wind, the stream of particles flowing from the young sun's surface, farther out, beyond what we now call the frost line, about 3 times Earth's distance from the sun. It was cold enough for ice to form, water ice, ammonia ice, methane ice, and because there was so much more of these materials than rock and metal, the clumps that formed there grew larger, much larger. These growing clumps, these planetesimals, ranged in size from kilometers to hundreds of kilometers across, and they continued to collide, to merge, the larger ones with stronger gravity pulling in the smaller ones, sweeping up material in their orbital paths. Near the sun, 4 rocky worlds were taking shape: Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, the terrestrial planets, worlds of metal cores and rocky mantles, too small and too hot to hold on to the light gases that made up most of the original nebula. The process was violent, extraordinarily violent. These weren't gentle accumulations, but catastrophic impacts. Bodies the size of moons slamming into each other at thousands of miles per hour, melting, vaporizing, merging, reforming. Earth itself, our world, suffered one of these collisions about 4.5 billion years ago, not long after it first formed, a Mars-sized body, which we've named Theia, after the Greek Titan who was mother to the moon goddess Selene, struck Earth at an oblique angle. The impact was unimaginable. It would have liquefied both bodies, sent enormous amounts of material spraying into orbit, and from that debris ring, over time, our moon coalesced, gathering itself from the scattered remnants of both worlds, which is why lunar rocks brought back by the Apollo missions have such similar composition to Earth's mantle. This collision did more than give us our moon. It tilted Earth's axis, giving us our seasons, and it may have added to Earth's spin, our 24-hour day, though the moon was much closer then, appearing enormous in the sky, and Earth rotated faster, a day lasting perhaps only 5 or 6 hours. Beyond the rocky planets, in the colder reaches of the disk, the gas giants were forming, Jupiter, Saturn, and they were forming fast. They needed to, because the sun's early phase, the T Tauri phase, would soon blow away all the remaining gas in the disk. Jupiter's core formed first, growing massive enough, somewhere between 10 and 20 Earth masses, that its gravity could capture hydrogen and helium directly from the nebula, and once that process started, it accelerated, the planet ballooning to its current size, 318 times Earth's mass, in perhaps as little as a few million years. Saturn followed a similar path, though it ended up somewhat smaller, perhaps because it formed later or farther out, where the disk was less dense, or because Jupiter's gravity disrupted the flow of material, or all of these reasons. The early solar system was chaos, and teasing out exact causes from effects billions of years later requires detective work written in stone and ice. These giant planets didn't stay where they formed. Computer models suggest they migrated, moving inward or outward through the disk, their gravity stirring everything, scattering planetesimals, clearing gaps in the disk, redirecting comets and asteroids. There's a theory called the Grand Tack that suggests Jupiter migrated inward first, perhaps getting as close as 1.5 times Earth's distance from the Sun before Saturn caught up with it. And the two planets are locked in a gravitational resonance, migrated back outward together, like partners in a cosmic dance. If this happened, and the evidence is suggestive, though not conclusive, it would explain many things. Why Mars is so small. Perhaps Jupiter swept through the region where Mars was forming, scattering most of the material, leaving only scraps to form the red planet. Why the asteroid belt exists as a belt and not a planet. The competing gravitational influences preventing the rocks from ever settling into a single world. Farther out still, Uranus and Neptune were forming, smaller than Jupiter and Saturn, but still massive compared to Earth. And something strange happened to them too. Models suggest they didn't form where they are now. They formed closer in perhaps between where Saturn and Uranus orbit today, and something probably gravitational interactions with Jupiter and Saturn flung them outward. Neptune may have actually formed closer to the Sun than Uranus, and then been scattered outward, leapfrogging past its companion, settling into the outermost orbit of the major planets, 30 times farther from the Sun than Earth, where a single year takes 165 Earth years to complete. This outward migration of Neptune had enormous consequences. Beyond Neptune's orbit lay the Kuiper Belt, a region filled with icy bodies left over from the solar system's formation, and as Neptune moved through or near this region, its gravity scattered these objects, sending them flying in all directions. Some were ejected from the solar system entirely. Some fell inward, becoming the short-period comets we see today, and some were thrown into the Oort cloud, a vast spherical shell of icy bodies that surrounds the entire solar system, extending perhaps halfway to the nearest star. This period of chaos and migration, about 600 million to 700 million years after the solar system formed, is called the Late Heavy Bombardment, though recent research questions whether it was truly a distinct event or just the tail end of the initial formation period. Either way, the inner solar system was pummeled. The moon's surface still bears the scars, the dark Maria, the seas that aren't seas, but vast impact basins filled with solidified lava, created when massive objects struck with enough force to crack the lunar crust and release molten rock from below. Earth was hit too, certainly, but our active geology has erased most of the evidence. Plate tectonics, weathering, erosion, biological processes, all of them constantly reshaping the surface, burying the past, though a few ancient impact structures remain, ghostly impressions in the oldest rocks. Through all of this violence, all of this chaos, the solar system was sorting itself. The heavy bombardment gradually declined as the planets swept their orbits clear, as the remaining planetesimals were either absorbed, ejected, or locked into stable resonances, safe harbors in the gravitational landscape. By about 4 billion years ago, the architecture was essentially set. 4 rocky worlds close to the Sun, 4 giants farther out, countless smaller bodies scattered throughout, and a new phase began. The long, slow cooling, the gradual evolution, the development of atmospheres and climates, and on at least one world, life. The young Earth was nothing like the world we know. The atmosphere was thick with carbon dioxide and nitrogen, water vapor, perhaps methane. No oxygen. Not yet. The surface was molten, or nearly so, cooling from the heat of formation and bombardment. Volcanic activity everywhere. The sky dark, the sun appearing dimmer through the haze. But water was there, somehow, either delivered by comets and asteroids from the outer solar system, or released from minerals in Earth's rocks, or both, and as the surface cooled, the water vapor condensed, fell as rain that may have lasted for thousands of years, filling the low places, forming the first oceans, and in those oceans, in some way we still don't fully understand, chemistry became biology. Molecules organized themselves into systems that could replicate, that could metabolize, that could evolve. And the story that began with a collapsing cloud of gas became a story of life, though that chapter belongs to Earth alone, as far as we know, the only inhabited world in our solar family. The other worlds followed their own paths, each one a laboratory of physics and chemistry, each one conducting its own experiment in planetary evolution. Mercury, closest to the sun, smallest of the true planets, became a world of extremes, its surface baked and frozen in turn, because with almost no atmosphere to hold heat, the day side soars to 430 degrees Celsius, while the night side plunges to minus 180, a swing of more than 600 degrees, the greatest temperature variation of any planet. Its core is enormous, proportionally, making up perhaps 60 to 70% of the planet's mass, which suggests that Mercury either formed from unusually metal-rich material, or that something stripped away much of its rocky mantle early in its history, perhaps a giant impact similar to the one that formed Earth's moon, or perhaps the intense heat and solar wind from the young sun simply vaporized the outer layers. The surface is ancient, heavily cratered, looking much like our moon, because without an atmosphere, without plate tectonics, without water, there's nothing to erase the scars. Every impact remains, a geological record stretching back billions of years. And there are strange features, long cliff faces called scarps, sometimes hundreds of kilometers long and up to a kilometer high, thought to be wrinkles in the planet's crust, formed as the interior cooled and contracted, shrinking Mercury like a raisin, its solid shell buckling under the compression. Venus, the second planet, became something else entirely, a cautionary tale about greenhouse effects, about how a world similar in size and composition to Earth could evolve into something hellish. Early Venus may have had oceans, water on its surface. For perhaps the first 2 billion years of its existence, but being closer to the sun, it received more solar energy, which meant more evaporation, more water vapor in the atmosphere, and water vapor is a greenhouse gas, trapping heat, causing more evaporation, a runaway feedback loop. Eventually the oceans boiled away. The water vapor rose high into the atmosphere, where ultraviolet light from the sun split it into hydrogen and oxygen. The light hydrogen escaped to space, the oxygen bound to rocks on the surface, and the water was gone, lost forever. What remained was carbon dioxide released from volcanic activity, with no water to dissolve it, no life to absorb it, no weathering cycle to lock it into rock. It accumulated, building an atmosphere 90 times denser than Earth's, thick enough that the pressure at the surface is like being a kilometer underwater. and that atmosphere traps heat with brutal efficiency, raising surface temperatures to 465 degrees Celsius, hot enough to melt lead, hot enough that the rock itself glows a dull red, and the clouds, those beautiful clouds that make Venus so bright in our sky, are made of sulfuric acid, raining down but evaporating before reaching the ground. The surface is young, geologically speaking, only about 500 million years old, which suggests that Venus resurfaces itself, perhaps through massive volcanic events that cover the entire planet, or through a different kind of tectonics, not plates sliding over each other as on Earth, but single-plate tectonics, where the entire crust periodically founders, sinking into the mantle, replaced by fresh lava. Mars, the fourth planet, took another path. It started with advantages. A day almost the same length as Earth's, an axis tilted similarly, given it seasons, and evidence suggests it once had liquid water on its surface, rivers carved valleys, water collected in impact craters, minerals formed that require water to exist. But Mars is small, only about a half Earth's diameter, a tenth of Earth's mass, and that mattered enormously because a planet's size determines how long it can retain its internal heat, and heat drives geological activity, which drives magnetic fields, which protect atmospheres from being stripped away by solar wind. Mars cooled faster, its core solidified, or at least became too sluggish to generate a strong magnetic field, and without that protection, the solar wind gradually stripped away its atmosphere over hundreds of millions of years, like wind eroding soil from a hillside, grain by grain, molecule by molecule. As the atmosphere thinned, the pressure dropped, and liquid water became unstable. It either froze into the ground, becoming permafrost, or sublimated directly into vapor and was lost to space. The riverbeds dried, the lakes evaporated, the planet grew cold and still. Now Mars is a desert, though perhaps not entirely dead. There may be liquid water deep underground, heated by residual warmth from the core and the polar ice caps, made of water ice and frozen carbon dioxide, grow and shrink with the seasons, one of the few active processes still occurring. The surface tells stories. Olympus Mons, the largest volcano in the solar system, rises 21 kilometers above the surrounding plains, nearly 3 times the height of Mount Everest, and it's a shield volcano built by countless eruptions of low-viscosity lava, piling up over millions of years, made possible because Mars lacks plate tectonics. The volcano stayed over its hotspot, growing and growing. Valles Marineris, the Great Canyon system, stretches 4,000 kilometers along the Martian equator, up to 7 kilometers deep in places. If it were on Earth, it would span from New York to Los Angeles, carved perhaps by tectonic activity or erosion, or a combination of both, a scar across a hemisphere. Beyond Mars, beyond the asteroid belt, where thousands of rocky fragments orbit, some as small as pebbles, some as large as mountains, we come to Jupiter, the king of planets, the giant among giants. Jupiter is not like the inner worlds, not a ball of rock with a thin atmosphere, but the reverse, a vast sphere of gas, mostly hydrogen and helium, the same material that makes up stars, and deep within, under crushing pressure, hydrogen takes on strange properties, becoming metallic, conducting electricity, generating Jupiter's powerful magnetic field, the strongest of any planet, The atmosphere is all we can see, bands of clouds, creams and browns and reds, moving in opposite directions, some flowing east, some west. Driven by the planet's rapid rotation, Jupiter spins faster than any other planet, a day lasting less than 10 hours. Despite being 11 times wider than Earth, this speed flattens it slightly, making it visibly oblate, wider at the equator than pole to pole. In those bands, storms rage and have raged for centuries. The Great Red Spot, an anticyclonic storm larger than Earth, has been observed since at least 1630, possibly longer, spinning counterclockwise, completing one rotation every 6 days, with wind speeds reaching 430 kilometers per hour. The spot changes. It's shrinking. Measurements from the 1800s show it was 4 times wider than Earth. Now it's only slightly larger, and no one knows why, whether it will disappear entirely or stabilize or oscillate in size. Jupiter keeps its secrets. Beneath the visible atmosphere, pressure and temperature increase, deeper and deeper. There may be no solid surface at all, just a gradual transition from gas to liquid to metallic hydrogen, and at the very center, perhaps a rocky core, 10 to 20 times Earth's mass, though even this is uncertain. Our models struggle with the conditions that exist in Jupiter's interior. The planet has rings, faint ones, made of dust from micrometeorite impacts on its inner moons. And speaking of moons, Jupiter has at least 95 of them, though most are tiny, captured asteroids, irregular in shape, but 4 are worlds in their own right. Io, the innermost, is the most volcanically active body in the solar system, its surface constantly reshaped by eruptions, plumes of sulfur and sulfur dioxide shooting hundreds of kilometers into space, all because Jupiter's gravity and the gravitational pulls of the other large moons flex Io like a stress ball, squeezing it, heating its interior through tidal friction. Europa, the second, is an ice world, its surface crisscrossed with cracks and ridges, almost no craters, which means the surface is young, constantly renewed, and beneath that ice, perhaps 15 to 25 kilometers thick, there may be an ocean, liquid water, kept warm by tidal heating, containing twice as much water as all of Earth's oceans combined. Ganymede, the third, is the largest moon in the solar system, bigger than Mercury, with its own magnetic field, the only moon known to have one. Its surface is a mix of old, dark terrain and younger grooved terrain, suggesting a complex geological history. Callisto, the fourth, is heavily cratered, ancient, geologically dead, or nearly so, its surface a record of 4 billion years of impacts. But even Callisto may hide an ocean beneath its battered crust, kept liquid by heat from radioactive decay in its rocky core. Saturn, the sixth planet, the jewel of the solar system, is similar to Jupiter in composition, mostly hydrogen and helium, but smaller, less massive, less dense, so much less dense that if you could find an ocean large enough, Saturn would float. It spins rapidly, too, a day lasting just 10.5 hours, and like Jupiter, it has atmospheric bands, though softer in color, creams and pale golds, with occasional storms, some of which appear as white spots, eruptions of ammonia or ice crystals from deeper layers. But what makes Saturn truly remarkable, what captures every eye that sees it through a telescope, are the rings, vast, impossibly thin, stretching hundreds of thousands of kilometers from the planet, but only tens of meters thick in most places, like a cosmic phonograph record. The rings are made of ice, billions of particles, ranging from dust grain size to house-sized chunks, each one an individual moon, orbiting Saturn in its own path. And they're young, relatively speaking, perhaps only 100 million years old, which raises the question of where they came from. Maybe a moon wandered too close, crossed the Roche limit, the distance at which tidal forces overcome a body's self-gravity, and was torn apart. Or maybe a comet was captured and shattered. Or maybe a collision between moons created the debris. Whatever the origin, the result is breathtaking. The rings are separated into bands with gaps between them, the Cassini division, the Encke gap, cleared by the gravitational influence of Saturn's moons, some of which orbit within the rings themselves. Shepherd moons, their gravity sculpting the ring edges, keeping them sharp. Saturn has even more moons than Jupiter, at least 146 at last count, many discovered only recently. Tiny things, but some are substantial. Titan, the largest, is bigger than Mercury, with a thick atmosphere, mostly nitrogen, and lakes on its surface. Not water, but liquid methane and ethane, the only other place in the solar system with stable bodies of liquid on its surface. Enceladus, tiny by comparison, barely 500 kilometers across, became one of the most intriguing discoveries of our age, because this small frozen moon, orbiting in the outer reaches of Saturn's system, is shooting geysers of water ice into space, plumes that spray from cracks near its south pole, fed by an ocean beneath its icy shell, warmed by tidal heating, just like Europa, another world with the ingredients for life hiding beneath a frozen surface. Beyond Saturn, the solar system grows darker, colder, the sun appears smaller, its warmth diminished, and here we find Uranus, the seventh planet, a world tilted on its side. Something massive struck Uranus early in its history, knocked it over, so that its axis of rotation lies almost in the plane of its orbit, where other planets spin like tops. Uranus rolls like a ball, its poles pointing toward and away from the sun as it orbits, creating the strangest seasons imaginable. Each pole experiences 42 years of continuous sunlight, followed by 42 years of continuous darkness, and the planet takes 84 years to complete one orbit. So each hemisphere gets one long summer, one long winter, and 2 brief spring and autumn periods, all stretched across human lifetimes. Uranus is an ice giant, distinct from the gas giants, smaller, with less hydrogen and helium proportionally, and more of what astronomers call ices, water, ammonia, methane, though under the pressures inside Uranus, these substances exist in exotic states, hot, dense fluids, perhaps superionic water, where oxygen forms a crystal lattice while hydrogen ions flow freely through it, conducting electricity, generating the planet's magnetic field. That magnetic field is strange, tilted 59 degrees from the planet's axis of rotation and offset from the center, as if the field is generated not in the core but in a shell around it, and it wobbles dramatically as the planet rotates, creating a magnetic environment unlike anywhere else we know. The atmosphere is mostly hydrogen and helium, with about 2% methane, and it's that methane that gives Uranus its blue-green color. Methane absorbs red light, reflects blue, painting the planet in soft aquamarine hues, featureless to the eye, though modern telescopes reveal faint bands and occasional storms in infrared wavelengths. Uranus has rings too, dark, thin rings, discovered only in 1977, when the planet passed in front of a star and astronomers noticed the starlight flickering, dimming briefly, multiple times, before and after Uranus itself blocked the star, revealing rings we'd never seen before. And it has moons, 27 known, named not for Greek and Roman deities like most solar system objects, but for characters from Shakespeare and Alexander Pope: Miranda, Ariel, Umbriel, Titania, Oberon, the 5 largest, each with its own character, its own history written in ice and rock. Miranda, the smallest of the large moons, has the most tortured surface, vast canyons, cliffs 20 kilometers high, regions of completely different terrain meeting at sharp boundaries, as if the moon was shattered, then reassembled, though the true explanation probably involves tidal heating and cryovolcanism, ice volcanoes, erupting slushes of water and ammonia instead of molten rock. Neptune, the 8th planet, the last of the giants, was found not by searching the sky, but by mathematics. Astronomers noticed that Uranus's orbit wasn't quite right. Something was pulling on it, perturbing its path, and by calculating where that something must be, they pointed their telescopes, and there it was, Neptune, exactly where the equations predicted. Neptune is similar to Uranus in size and composition, another ice giant, but its atmosphere is more active, storms visible even from Earth. The Great Dark Spot, discovered by Voyager 2 in 1989, was an anticyclonic storm similar to Jupiter's Great Red Spot, though it disappeared within a few years. Unlike Jupiter's persistent feature, wind speeds on Neptune are the highest in the solar system, reaching 2,000 kilometers per hour, faster than the speed of sound on Earth, driven by some internal heat source we don't fully understand, because Neptune radiates more than twice as much heat as it receives from the Sun, even though it's 30 times farther from the Sun than Earth, receiving 900 times less sunlight. Neptune's largest moon, Triton, is strange among large moons because it orbits backward, retrograde, opposite to Neptune's rotation, which means it wasn't formed alongside the planet but was captured, probably from the Kuiper Belt, making it a distant cousin of Pluto, a Kuiper Belt object that wandered too close and was snared by Neptune's gravity. Triton is geologically active. Its surface is young, only a few million years at most, with nitrogen geysers that erupt through the ice, creating dark streaks on the surface, and it's spiraling slowly inward, tidal forces gradually slowing its orbit. In a few billion years it will cross Neptune's Roche limit and be torn apart, forming perhaps the most spectacular ring system in the solar system, though there will be no one to see it. Beyond Neptune, in the cold dark, reaches past the orbits of the planets, lies the Kuiper Belt, a disk of icy bodies, remnants from the solar system's formation, never gathered into planets, too distant, too sparse, too disturbed by Neptune's migration. Here we find Pluto, once called the 9th planet, now designated a dwarf planet, not because it's small, though it is, smaller than Earth's moon, but because it hasn't cleared its orbital neighborhood. It shares the Kuiper Belt with thousands of similar objects, Haumea, Makemake, Eris, and countless smaller bodies. Pluto itself is a complex world, despite its size, with mountains of water ice as hard as rock in the cold, plains of nitrogen ice that flow like glaciers, a tenuous atmosphere that freezes and falls as snow when Pluto moves farther from the Sun in its elliptical orbit, then sublimates again as it approaches. It has 5 moons. The largest, Charon, is so big relative to Pluto that they form a binary system orbiting a common center of gravity that lies between them, not inside Pluto. 2 worlds locked face to face, each always showing the same hemisphere to the other, dancing together through the dark, and farther still, beyond the Kuiper belt, beyond the scattered disk, where objects on highly elliptical orbits loop in and out, there is the Oort cloud, theoretical, never directly observed, but inferred from the comets that fall toward the Sun from every direction, from a spherical shell surrounding the entire solar system. The Oort cloud may contain trillions of icy bodies, extending perhaps halfway to the nearest star, a light-year or more from the Sun, barely bound by gravity, easily perturbed by passing stars, by the tidal force of the galaxy itself, and when perturbed, these objects fall inward, taking thousands or millions of years to reach the inner solar system, where the Sun's heat vaporizes their ices, creating the tales we see, the comets that have terrified and inspired humans throughout history. Between all these worlds filling the spaces is dust, gas, the solar wind, particles streaming from the Sun, protons and electrons, creating a bubble called the heliosphere, which protects the solar system from interstellar radiation. The heliosphere extends far beyond Pluto, beyond the Kuiper belt, to the heliopause, where the solar wind finally meets the interstellar medium and stops, compressed, deflected, marking the boundary between what belongs to the Sun and what belongs to the galaxy. 2 spacecraft have crossed that boundary, Voyager 1 in 2012, Voyager 2 in 2018, carrying with them golden records, messages from humanity, sounds and images, music and greetings in multiple languages, just in case someone finds them, billions of years from now, when the Sun has changed, when Earth may no longer exist. These artifacts will still be drifting, ambassadors to deep time. The solar system is not static, not frozen in time. It continues to evolve. The Sun is slowly brightening, about 10% brighter now than when it formed, and it will continue to brighten in 1 billion years, perhaps less. Earth's oceans will boil away, the planet becoming another Venus, uninhabitable, and the habitable zone will shift outward, perhaps to Mars, perhaps to the moons of Jupiter. In 5 billion years, give or take, the Sun will exhaust the hydrogen in its core. Fusion will slow, the core will contract, heat, and fusion will begin in a shell around the core. The Sun will swell, becoming a red giant, its outer layers expanding, engulfing Mercury, perhaps Venus, perhaps Earth, though by then Earth will long since have lost its oceans, its atmosphere, any trace of the life that once flourished there. Saturn's rings will be gone, dispersed by collisions, by radiation, by the slow grinding of time. Triton will have spiraled into Neptune and been destroyed. Mars will have cooled completely, its core frozen solid, and the dance of the planets will continue, slower, colder, darker, until the Sun sheds its outer layers, becomes a white dwarf, a dense ember slowly cooling, and the planets orbit in eternal twilight. but that is far ahead, unimaginably far. For now, the solar system is in its middle age, stable, mature, its violent youth behind it, and on one small world, circling an ordinary star in an unremarkable part of the galaxy, life has emerged, evolved, developed consciousness, and looked outward, mapping the cosmic neighborhood, sending probes to distant worlds, asking questions about origins and endings, finding in the solar system both a mirror and a mystery. We've sent our eyes and ears outward, built machines that can withstand radiation and cold and the vast emptiness between worlds, and through them we've touched the surfaces of places humans may never walk. We've landed rovers on Mars, watched them crawl across rust-colored plains, drill into rocks, analyze soil, search for signs that life once existed there or might still exist, hidden underground, waiting. We've dropped a probe through Titan's atmosphere, watched it descend by parachute through orange haze, landed on a shore beside a methane sea, saw rocks made of ice, sand made of organic molecules, a world so strange and yet so familiar, with weather and seasons and lakes just made of different substances, operating at temperatures where water is stone and methane flows like water. We've flown past Pluto, New Horizons spacecraft, taken 9.5 years to reach it, and in those few hours of closest approach, transformed Pluto from a fuzzy dot in our best telescopes to a real place, with mountains and glaciers and a heart-shaped plain of frozen nitrogen, revealing that even in the outermost reaches, worlds are more complex than we imagined. We've sent Cassini to orbit Saturn for 13 years, watching the seasons change, studying the rings in detail never before possible, discovering new moons, new structures, before finally, running low on fuel, commanded to dive into Saturn's atmosphere, to burn up, to become part of the world it studied, ensuring it wouldn't accidentally contaminate any moon where life might exist. And all of this, every mission, every discovery, adds layers to our understanding, but also reveals how much we don't know, how many mysteries remain. We don't know exactly how planets form. We have models, theories, simulations, but watching it happen is impossible. It takes millions of years, and we've only been looking at other star systems for a few decades, finding thousands of exoplanets, worlds around other stars, some similar to Jupiter, some to Earth, some unlike anything in our solar system. Hot Jupiters orbiting closer to their stars than Mercury orbits the Sun, super-Earths, mini-Neptunes, categories we never needed before. And these discoveries make our solar system seem both ordinary and special. Ordinary because planets are common. Most stars have them. Special because every system is different, shaped by the particular conditions of its formation, the mass of material available, the presence or absence of giant planets, the history of collisions and migrations. We don't know if life exists elsewhere in our solar system. The conditions are there, on Europa, on Enceladus, on Titan, perhaps. Liquid water, organic molecules, energy sources, the ingredients we think are necessary, but necessary is not sufficient. And searching is difficult. These oceans are buried beneath kilometers of ice. Reaching them will require technology we're still developing. We don't know what causes Jupiter's great red spot to persist while other storms fade. We don't know why Uranus and Neptune radiate more heat than they receive. We don't know if Saturn's rings are unique or if they cycle, forming, dispersing, reforming over billions of years. Every answer breeds new questions, deeper questions, and that's perhaps the most profound thing about exploring the solar system. It teaches us humility, shows us that nature is more creative than our theories, more complex than our models, always surprising us, always holding something back. The solar system is a reminder of scale, of time, of our place in the cosmos. Earth is tiny, a mote of dust in a vast space, and yet it's everything to us, the only home we've ever known. And looking at other worlds, seeing their desolation, their beauty, their strangeness, makes Earth seem more precious, more fragile. We are the universe becoming aware of itself. Star stuff contemplating stars. And in studying the solar system, we're studying our origins, because everything here came from that original nebula, including us. The calcium in our bones formed in dying stars, the iron in our blood, the carbon in our cells, all of it forged in stellar furnaces, scattered by supernovae, gathered by gravity, shaped by time into planets and moons, and eventually, impossibly, life. There's something profound about standing on Earth and looking at Mars, knowing that the same laws of physics govern both, the same chemistry, the same fundamental forces, and yet the outcomes are so different. One world living, one world dead, or mostly dead, separated by such a small difference in size, in distance from the sun, showing us how contingent everything is, how delicate the balance. And there's something humbling about the timescales. 4.5 billion years, a span so long that all of human history, all of recorded civilization, fits into the last few seconds. If you compress the solar system's age into a single day, we are newcomers, late arrivals, witnesses to a story already billions of years in the telling. The solar system will outlast us, almost certainly, even if we spread to other worlds, even if we become a truly spacefaring species. The sun's lifespan is measured in billions of years, and civilizations, we don't know. We have no data. We're the only one we've found, and we've only been technological for a few centuries. A blink, less than a blink. But right now, in this moment, we're here, looking outward, asking questions, sending our instruments to touch distant worlds. And there's something beautiful in that, something defiant, refusing to accept ignorance, refusing to be content with just our own small world, reaching beyond, always reaching. The solar system continues its ancient dance, indifferent to us, following the mathematics of gravity, the laws of thermodynamics, playing out the consequences of its formation, slowly evolving towards some distant future we can model but never see. And we continue watching, learning, piecing together the story, finding in the other worlds both mirrors and warnings, seeing what Earth might have been, might become, using the solar system as a laboratory to understand planetary science, climate, geology, the conditions for life. Sometimes I imagine standing on another world, looking back at Earth, seeing it as a pale blue dot, the way the Voyager spacecraft photographed it from the edge of the solar system, and feeling that mixture of loneliness and connection, knowing that everything I've ever known, everyone I've ever loved, every human who has ever lived, is on that tiny pixel of light suspended in a sunbeam, as Carl Sagan said, fragile, temporary, precious beyond measure. The solar system has been our teacher, showing us that we're part of something larger, that Earth is not the center, but one world among many, that the universe operates on scales of time and space that dwarf human experience, and yet somehow we've learned to comprehend it, to measure it, to send our creations across billions of kilometers, to stand in spirit, if not in body, on alien shores. Tonight, looking up, I see the planets as wandering lights again. Venus bright in the evening, Jupiter rising later, Mars a rust-colored spark, and I know them now, not as gods, not as mysterious fires, but as worlds, real places with mountains and valleys, storms and seasons, each one a chapter in the story that began with a collapsing cloud, the story that includes us, the story that continues. The distances are vast, the timescales immense, the mysteries profound, and yet now we're here, small creatures on a small world, looking outward, understanding, wondering, carrying forward the impulse that has driven us since we first looked up, the desire to know, to explore, to comprehend our place in this grand cosmic dance. And in that desire, in that reaching outward, we fulfill something essential, something that connects us to the stars themselves, because we are made of star stuff, organized into patterns that can think, that can wonder, that can build spacecraft and write equations and dream of walking on distant worlds. The solar system turns, patient, eternal, indifferent, and beautiful beyond words, a family of worlds bound by gravity and history, each one unique, each one a world entire, and we, brief as we are, have learned to read their surfaces, to understand their atmospheres, to piece together their stories, and in doing so, we've learned to read our own story, to understand where we came from, and perhaps where we're going. The night deepens, the stars grow brighter, and somewhere out there, beyond Neptune, beyond Pluto, the Voyager spacecraft continue their journey, carrying messages from Earth, silent ambassadors drifting toward other stars, reaching the heliopause, crossing into interstellar space, leaving behind the solar system, but carrying its story with them and ours into the dark, into the endless night between stars, into whatever comes next.